Discrimination Tribunal appointment of members lodged by the Minister for Social Security, and the main respondent is the Chair of the Health and Social Security Scrutiny Panel. I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to appoint, in accordance with the Employment and Discrimination Tribunal Jersey Regulations 2014, the following persons as members of the Jersey Employment and Discrimination Tribunal for a period of 5 years.
Minister.
Sorry. Melanie Granfield, Employer Panel Member. Kylie Henley, Employer Panel Member. Mark Richardson, Employer Panel Member. Christopher Stevenson, Discrimination Panel Member. Richard Renouf, Discrimination Panel Member. Alison Brown, Discrimination Panel Member. And Alana Binney, Discrimination Panel Member.
Minister.
Thank you, sir. I am pleased to propose the appointment of 7 new members to the Jersey Employment and Discrimination Tribunal, subject, of course, to the approval of the States Assembly. Assembly members will find summaries of the appointees' backgrounds in my written report, as well as more detail about the functions of the tribunal itself. If this proposition is agreed to, the appointments will take effect once the new members have taken the oath of office before the Royal Court. I am satisfied that the recruitment process, details of which are set out in my written report, was carried out in a fair and transparent way, and I am grateful to the Deputy Chair of the Jersey Appointments Commission for confirming that fact. Sir, I make the proposition.
Thank you. Is the proposition seconded? Yes, sir. Does any member wish to speak on the proposition? No member wishes to speak. Then I close the debate. Those in favour of adopting the proposition kindly show.
Call for the appel, please, sir.
The appel is called for. Invite members to return to their seats. The vote is on the appointment of tribunal members to the Employment and Discrimination Tribunal, and I ask the greffier to open the voting and members to vote. Members have had the opportunity of casting their vote. Then I ask the greffier to close the voting. The proposition has been adopted. 38 votes for, no votes contra, no abstentions. The next item is Cannabis, Decriminalisation of Personal Possession and Recreational Use, P31, lodged by Deputy Coles. The main responder is the Minister for Health and Social Services. Deputy, there are a number of amendments. Do you accept any of them?
Yes, sir. I'm accepting my own amendment, which I believe is Amendment 3, and the Council of Ministers' amendment, which I believe is Amendment 2. And
you're not accepting the other 2 amendments?
No, sir.
Very well. Do you wish to have the proposition read as amended by those amendments you accepted?
Yes, please.
The members agree to have it read as amended? Very well. Then I ask the greffier to read the proposition as amended.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion: A, that the personal possession and recreational use of cannabis should be decriminalised; B, to request the Council of Ministers to bring forward proposals for consideration by the Assembly with the legislation to include, but not be limited to, potential approaches to the decriminalisation, legalisation and regulation of cannabis, use in the presence of minors, personal cultivation and preparation, social supply, restriction on the sale to minors, approaches to minors or vulnerable people coerced into cannabis-related activities, total acceptable gram allowance, restrictions on areas of consumption, restrictions on driving under the influence of cannabis, and relevant roadside capacity tests.
Deputy.
Thank you, sir. If I may, sir, I'd like to start with a question for the Solicitor General. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs sent a letter to the Health Minister, which was circulated to all members. In that letter, there was a term used of simple possession. I'd just like the Solicitor General to confirm if this is a legal reference and how it would apply in law, and is it different from normal possession and possession with intent to supply?
It's not a term that appears in the misuse of drugs law. It's a term that's widely used by criminal lawyers and courts. It denotes possession for no other purpose than consumption by the possessor. It is different from possession with intent to supply, which is an intention to give it to others. So simple possession simply means my own drugs for my own use.
Yes.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the Solicitor General for that answer. I'd also like to thank the Solicitor General, as we did have a meeting at the end of the last sitting around this proposal, as well as my engagement with the Minister for Home Affairs, Leon, the Chief Minister, as well as my fellow backbenchers who brought their amendments, as well as the Children's Commissioner. The Children's Commissioner and the Solicitor General obviously pointed out the issue that I had inadvertently created and why that I have actually had to bring my own amendment to remove the over-18s part of this proposition. It's very difficult in trying to balance the rights and the wrongs without sending out the wrong message out into the public, especially when it comes to young people. But my question still remains at the end of this proposition, is do we still believe that criminalising people for the personal use of cannabis is the right thing to do? So why did I bring this proposition in this first place? It was the intention of the previous government, with the previous Home Affairs Minister, to have an in-committee debate around cannabis, because the world's view on the subject is changing, and we should be considering changing with it. Unfortunately, with the change of government and the new Home Affairs Minister, this in-committee debate was no longer going to take place, as this was not one of her priorities. So I thought I could have brought an in-committee debate myself, and we could have all discussed it, but there'd have been no vote at the end to actually give a direction to government for what we want to see change and how we want things to change with it. There's a satirical quote that goes around, and it's either around the definition of stupidity or the definition of insanity. Either way, it's about doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Jersey criminalised cannabis in the 1960s. So here we are, 60 years later, still criminalising people, but nothing's changed. People still use cannabis daily. But what has changed is the way that government deals with substance use and substance use within our society. We've changed to a harm reduction strategy, which means that we have to accept that people will use substances, and actually to offer them support when they need it is the best way to get them off substances rather than criminalising them. This is work that has been based on very eminent psychologists, the likes of Gabor Mate, a Canadian-Hungarian who's done a lot of work around addiction. I found it quite difficult with the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs letter, because what that letter stated was going very much against the strategy the government brought forward last year. So to me, it seems there are still elements that are at odds with strategies and enforcement. So how big is the problem of cannabis convictions and interactions with the police? I think it's fair to say at the moment that there is nobody who is in prison and has been charged for the personal possession of cannabis alone. These crimes and convictions are normally associated with more serious offences, which ends up with someone in prison. However, the people who are being arrested, cautioned, forced to go to a parish hall inquiry, are still being exposed to our law enforcement and our judicial system. Rightly or wrongly, these people can end up at a parish hall inquiry and receiving a £200 fine for possession of 15 grams of cannabis. This is still considered a form of decriminalisation, but the £200 fine and the appearance at parish hall inquiry makes it a decriminalised act with civil sanctions. This is still a type of conviction, and it would still appear on an enhanced DBS check. So anybody who does this in their youth, over the age of 18, but then may wish to go into teacher training, would actually be barred from teaching in school because they'd have a conviction for drugs. So what this proposition seeks is to take this form of decriminalisation to the next step, and by removing the involvement of the police for a limited amount of personal possession. Policing of cannabis now has become very, very difficult because we've legalised the use of medicinal cannabis, which means that somebody who has a prescription is allowed to carry their full prescription around with them at all times and would be able to use their prescription in the time that they wish to use it. The problem for the police is now they're not allowed to ask an individual if they have a prescription until the point that they believe an offence has been occurred and a caution has been written. At that point, the person should then declare whether or not they have a prescription. If they can't prove that they have a prescription at that point, the police have to seize their cannabis, tag it for the person who it has been removed from, hold it, and then return it if a prescription is presented. If a prescription is not presented, it then has to be analysed to confirm that it is cannabis, and then after that fact, they would then have to decide whether charges should be brought. Another interesting problem that the police will face is if somebody is smoking cannabis in a public space with a prescription, the police have to know before they charge the person what offence is actually being committed. Because if you have a prescription, you are not using an illegal substance in a public space. You are misusing a prescription, which is a different offence to what you can be charged for. So this makes action for the police very, very difficult. It's also very costly. It leads to a lot of financial with the analysis of the substance, whether it turns out to be cannabis or not. But mostly, it's about time. We have very limited police resources, and for many people, this is a very small action and small crime. So why are we wasting so much time on it? Some might say that the answer is, well, why don't we toughen up how prescribed cannabis is used? Well, the problem with that is we don't impose other restrictions on other medications. If somebody's taking ADHD medication, or if somebody has to inject a medication at varying intervals, we would not tell them when and where they can use their prescriptions. Having conversations with some frontline police officers, they said, well, some of the biggest problems they have are at outdoor events, where someone might take a large quantity of their prescription, but of course, if they have their prescription with them, as in the note from the doctor that says they are allowed to have prescribed cannabis, this cannot be removed from them, even though they know they're there probably for the wrong reasons. However, if we were to make an acceptable allowance for what people are allowed to carry on them, on their person, this would clear this action up, especially for the police. That if somebody is carrying far too much on them at one time, that the police know they can either just ignore it, let that person move on their way, although if that person is under the age of 18 or can't prove that they're over the age of 18, they would still be allowed to remove the cannabis from them, as they would not legally have a prescription. It seems that cannabis is becoming more of an administrative burden and a drain on our police resources than the impact that it'll actually have on society. For a little bit of context, I remembered the 2000 Euros football championships, where it was jointly shared by the Netherlands and Belgium. Belgium famous for its beer, the Netherlands famous for something else. With the crowd trouble that erupted at that football tournament, the majority of the trouble actually happened in Belgium. This year, we've seen the Euros taking place in Germany, a country which has recently legalised the recreational use and possession of cannabis. Not decriminalised, legalised. There is a difference. The German government and people of the German towns are actually encouraging travelling supporters to use cannabis, as they are aware it will create less crowd trouble than if people were drinking to excess. The Misuse of Drugs Advisory Council's letter mentioned the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. So I feel it's important to mention that the following countries are all signatories to this convention. All have decriminalised cannabis so that there are no sanctions at all. These countries are Belize, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Jamaica, Luxembourg, Malta, Mexico, the Netherlands, Peru, Poland, Portugal, South Africa, Spain, Switzerland, and Uruguay. A number of countries have taken different actions to cannabis, which includes decriminalisation, but still with civil sanctions. However, there are countries with some form of legalisation. Germany, most notably Canada, and 26 states within the United States. The Convention allows the sovereignty of its signatory nations. It allows these countries to decide their own rules on punishing people for possession within their own countries. So when the letter mentioned about the issues with our nearest neighbours, mainly France, I found an interesting one. We have no land borders with France. We have no freedom of movements within France. We're only a small market for the illegal trade that already exists. So given that they share a land border with Spain, Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland, all these countries have free movement of people and, most importantly, free movement of goods. There are no checks on anything that be travelling around these countries, and yet France has not posted an objection to any of these countries. We have an illegal market in Jersey. Let's be real about this. We share good intelligence with France and the UK, and I cannot see any reason why this wouldn't continue. Now here comes one of the tricky parts with cannabis, and that's mental health. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there is a connection between mental health and cannabis use, because cannabis psychosis is a thing, and it is something that I have witnessed firsthand. Now, it doesn't affect everybody, and those people who are affected by cannabis psychosis, it can be very impactful, and the effects are very disturbing. I will not sugarcoat this. I know someone that during an episode of psychosis was arrested, found to be in possession. This person was admitted into Orchard House, where they were treated, released, and on release they received a notice to attend a parish hall inquiry for possession. Did this person benefit from being sent to a parish hall inquiry after what they had been through? Did society benefit from putting this person through a parish hall inquiry because of the possession? Did it stop this person from using cannabis illegally again? Unfortunately, the answer to all these questions is no. It did not. People do not use cannabis thinking they will be caught, that it will have a bad effect on them. People do not use cannabis because it's illegal or not. Like most people, members of this assembly included, we use substances to help ourselves regulate. Sometimes we call this a crutch or a vice. How many members enjoy a glass of wine or a beer at the end of a hard day? How many members enjoy a cigarette? How many members enjoy something sugary just to get them through? Alcohol and cigarettes are proven to be worse for our health. Alcohol worse for the society than cannabis, but both are still legal. It is my belief that we should change tactics, as the war on drugs has not worked. And the first step is to stop criminalising those who use cannabis. Bring our enforcement in line with our substance use strategy, offer people the support when they need it the most. And with that, sir, I make the proposition.
Is the proposition seconded?
Yes, sir.
Very well. There's an amendment lodged by Deputy Alex Curtis, and I ask the greffier to read that amendment.
Paragraph A. After the word possession, insert the words personal cultivation. In paragraph B, after the words relevant roadside capacity tests, insert the following new bullet point: total acceptable cultivation allowance.
Deputy.
Thank you, sir. As an amendment to Deputy Cole's main proposition, I intend to keep this brief. Firstly, I want to reiterate that this proposition, to which this amendment amends, is only an in-principle one. The Assembly would not be changing law or policy today, and if Part B were to be adopted, the Government would undertake several elements of policy work to bring back to the Assembly. As amended by the Council of Ministers, this would include bringing forward possible proposals on personal cultivation. So why, members might ask, have I retained my amendment? Well, for one, discussing with Deputy Coles, we both want to see these as debates, where people can inform and engage and understand members' perspectives. This should not be just a chance to reiterate views. We should be learning. And retaining this as a standalone debate allows us to discuss what cultivation means and what decriminalisation without it would look like. Secondly, I believe it is important that should the Assembly adopt Part A, that the principle of personal cultivation should be allowed within that decision. Perhaps it's best to look at where we stand today, and Deputy Coles has touched on this. Some state members and members of the public would argue cannabis is somewhat decriminalised already. The Attorney General's guidance permits the use of written cautions for small amounts of the possession of cannabis. The rise in medicinal prescribing has allowed, I believe, about 6% of the working population to access high THC content cannabis legally, so long as they pay their prescription, doctor's appointment fees, and prove their medical requirement. Decriminalising possession and consumption would not be a significant step away from that landscape and would perhaps allow us to prescribe different amounts and apply better controls over where we may apply criminal penalties should breaches occur. What would remain the case, however, is that it would be a criminal act in any case to procure or supply cannabis, even when the possession of said cannabis is decriminalised. So one argument one may think is we should look to legalise, and we've heard that some jurisdictions are moving towards that. We could look to licence a supply, tax a product, and whilst these are relevant conversations to have, and likely work that will take part under Part B following the Council of Ministers amendment, there are many good reasons that is not the step to take now. One could consider you could decriminalise the act of small dealing and importing, but I, for one, have no interest in supporting illegal dealing and importing and the impact that crime activities have on our community. How else then, if the Assembly agrees to decriminalise the personal possession and consumption, do we square this circle? To me, and many other jurisdictions that have decriminalised, the answer is personal cultivation. This would enable islanders to produce their own supply, be assured of the quality and provenance of what they produce, and feel safe in the knowledge they are not enabling crime and the impact on society that it has. How does this work in practice? Well, should the Assembly agree to the principles today, officers will be working on the best solutions for Jersey for members to debate. However, we can look at other jurisdictions and the policies they have and the reasons behind them. I hope members will have noted the specific examples given in my report. If they have, they will have seen the common thread that is between these. Firstly, jurisdictions apply a limit on the number of plants that can be grown. This is more practical to work than the gram allowance, as a plant will produce differently under different scenarios. This allowance can be per person or per household, and that can be debated by the states later. Jurisdictions often apply a total dried plant matter to be allowed to be kept at home on private premises once harvested. This is no different to the allowed plant matter that one would be permitted to keep under decriminalisation of possession. Thirdly, limits are typically applied on where the plant can be grown, on private property and mostly prescribed as out of public view. Jersey would not need to be limited to these controls, and we could find and adopt our own policy that best suits the island. And members can likely picture a combination of these would enable a proportionate policy, both enforceable and manageable. Like we've heard, members must always consider risks. And there are always going to be risks, and these may include, when we discuss personal cultivation, the quality of produce, all things. Home growers are likely to be less consistent with their growing techniques than the pure professionals and what we see in medicinal cannabis. This could mean plant spoilage and could mean mould, that if then consumed could have a health impact. But on the other side, imported illegal cannabis is also likely to be of mixed quality. Only the medically grown cannabis supplied to that 6% of working population is assured to a THC value and to a quality. And I don't think we want to be encouraging the proliferation, if it does indeed occur, of medical grade and, in essence, a prescribed material being used outside of a prescription. We want our clinical standards and reputation to be better than that. And on the note of quality, I have been informed that home growers are likely to produce a lower potency cannabis than that grown in optimum growing conditions, which would make it a less strong product, akin to drinking a lower ABV product. Another risk would be smells and nuisances, that neighbours would be impacted by the smell of growing plants. We already have a statutory nuisances law that deals with odour, and by having a plant limit and location restrictions on where a plant can be grown, I see no reason this can't be handled within the details to avoid any neighbour impact. Indeed, I would suggest that those who illicitly grow it around the world at the moment do their best to hide the proof that it can even be detected by their neighbours. The last one may be the contamination using materials in airborne seeds to the medicinal cannabis industry. But those of us who have been lucky to visit those facilities will know how wonderful those facilities are and how tight a ship they run. Well, those are the risks. We should consider the opportunities. We should look at both sides of this. And I will start with one, which is education. In many areas of our life where we are consumers, we are growing to say we need to be educated consumers. Our food systems, I think, are things we need to tackle obesity, to tackle our consumption of drink, of alcohol or tobacco. We need to be better educated on the impacts and effects, and ultimately the provenance and location of anything we consume. And so I think those who are tighter connected to anything they consume can only be good for education. The second one, I don't want to make light of this one, is if, in the main debate, the Estates Assembly agree with the principle of decriminalisation of possession and consumption, then we should be thinking, for those people, about the cost incurred of anything. We debate every year duty rises on alcohol and the impact someone has to enjoy their leisurely pastime. And for somebody to have the opportunity to be afforded the chance to grow their own product is, in essence, enabling access and inclusion. And I really don't want to understate that one. We debate this all the time, the cost of living. It is something the government's aimed to address. Should we adopt the principles, then I think it applies here as well. And then I want to look at the last one, which is satisfaction and enjoyment. People have hobbies and get a lot of enjoyment out of hobbies which grant them responsibility, interest, skill and profession. The island's got a great history of horticulturalists. We're not normally horticulturalists in the sense of cannabis, but we know how much satisfaction there can be from gardening, from growing, from brewing, from baking. And again, I think it should be entirely recognised that part of people's lives is taking responsibility over things. And most of us know that horticulture is a great place. You water your plant every day, you look after its condition. And where we have a society, perhaps, where responsibility and the chances to take self-sovereignty about things you do yourself are becoming more limited, for our mental health, people should be offered those rights. So lastly, I want to address what decriminalisation would look like without cultivation. And it would be, in short, that islanders could be sentenced in the Royal Court for growing, for being a producer of cannabis, despite the fact that once harvested, that level of cannabis would be decriminalised to both possess and consume. So really, no matter how cannabis arrives at a consumer, it must be grown. So should the state support decriminalisation, allow consumers to grow their own?
Is it seconded, the amendment?
Yes, sir.
Does any member wish to speak on the amendment? Deputy Tadier.
Thank you, sir. I almost thought I heard a groan there, but that can't be right. We're only in Tuesday afternoon. So in 1204, I'm only joking. Although I may reserve the right to refer to Le Chenve at some point during if not in this speech, in a later speech, and remind members of what that means. I'm happy to support this amendment, first of all, because it has been raised with me over the years by supporters of those. I had a constituent at one point, I think he's moved out of St. Brelard now, who has been a long-term campaigner to be able to grow his own cannabis for medicinal or recreational use. And I think increasingly you could argue that the line is becoming blurred between the two. We may be able to touch on that later on. I also think that Deputy Alex Curtis has made a very good case for this, because it's in the context of if we are going to decriminalise the use and possession of personal amounts of cannabis, which can come in different forms, of course. And it would be a folly if we said to people, OK, we decriminalise it, but there are only really two ways that you can obtain cannabis. One's through a legal route, which is as a medicinal form, and for those people, we don't need to decriminalise it because they're possessing it legally, even if they may be using it in a way which might ultimately be illegal, for example, smoking it. I still think, just to say at this stage, that the nuance between smoking and vaporising medicinal cannabis is probably one which the previous government was overzealous about. A previous health minister was overzealous about making that distinction. But we're not really here to talk about that at this juncture. So the other way that most people who want to use cannabis, if we decriminalise it, the way that they will be obtaining that is through an illegal supply chain. So cannabis has to come to the island, and as no doubt other members will say in a moment or in the next part of the debate, that will have all sorts of problems attached to it. The fact that it's an illegal supply chain and the fact that the quality of it, especially if it's in resin form, will be subject to all sorts of chemical and cutting processes that the individual who ends up using it doesn't know what they're really consuming. Whereas somebody who wishes to take pride in the growing of their product, to know exactly who's done the research to say this is the type of cannabis that I wish to produce and consume, and it works for my needs, whether they're recreational or medicinal, will have the autonomy and the ability to do that. I'm also minded to think and understand that when it comes to alcohol, you can brew your own alcohol at home. So if you want to make yourself a nice rhubarb wine or a beer or a cider, you can do that. And as long as you're not selling it, that's perfectly legal. And so I think if we were decriminalising it, cannabis, then it would be strange to say that you can't grow your own at home. So for me, the only reason you might vote against this is if you had no intention of supporting the decriminalisation in the first place. But I think it's still sensible to support this as a safeguard to make sure that if we do decriminalise, then a legal method that people can have to obtain good quality products, that they know what's in it and that they had some input into getting it here, that they should be able to use that mechanism rather than relying on a very dark black market or illegal market to be able to procure their drug.
Deputy Jones.
Thank you, sir. I think Deputy Tadier said a lot of what I wanted to say, but I think my main point is, I worked in the past with the fair trade movement and looking at supply chains on a number of commodities and how along that supply chain there is a number of very vulnerable users, and this supply chain is no different. And I think it's very important, as Deputy Tadier and Deputy Alex Curtis has alluded to, is that if we decriminalise the consumption, we should also look at how we procure what we're consuming. And at the moment, a lot of cannabis coming into Jersey comes from the dark web and is ordered online. And so inadvertently at the moment, and if we aren't able to be able to cultivate for own use in the future in Jersey, if we do decriminalise cannabis, we will be inadvertently supporting organised crime groups. The cannabis market, for example, represents 38% of organised crime group drug revenue in the EU, and of 11.4 billion euros annually. And in the UK, this estimates around £3 billion. And of course, the social harms are enormous. We may not see that at the acute end here in Jersey, or many of us don't. But this does include human trafficking, debt bondage, and modern slavery. And so I would really like to hear from the Minister of Justice and Home Affairs in this regard. I know that she is working on a modern slavery law, and of course this topic and this issue is absolutely key within the supply chain around cannabis, and I would hope that she sees that the cultivation in Jersey is actually an important thing to try to stem Jersey's own impact on modern slavery along the supply chain. And so I think it's really important that this proposition of Deputy Alex Curtis is supported, and that we can curtail money reaching the black market, organised crime groups, and the exploitation of vulnerable people in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on this amendment? No other member wishes to speak on this amendment? I close the debate and call upon Deputy Curtis to respond.
That's a somewhat shorter debate than I had anticipated, but I presume it's widespread support that's causing that. And I note how awkward it is to say Deputy Alex Curtis, and I think we need to find a better solution for people with shared surnames. Right, well, thank you to those who did speak and highlighted the kind of the comparisons to those who can brew their own at home for alcohol limits. And I think what Deputy Taddia said is really important. And what I really wanted to stress during my opening speech was this isn't about potentially members supporting decriminalisation. It's about members appreciating that should Part A go through, we want to address those safeguards. And Deputy Jeune reiterated that. And so I think there are a huge number of things that we have to deal with regards to supply chain and all the challenges that were so well listed. But I really think this is a fairly simple one for me. If we're going to allow the decriminalisation, that is the if, then I see no reason why we shouldn't at least agree to the personal cultivation. And just to once again address why I want us to take the vote on this, and I hope members will vote in favour, is whilst the Council of Ministers have put in Part B to do the work on personal cultivation, Part A is what provides a level of in-principle decision-making, and I think it has to go hand in hand in Part A. Hence, I didn't let this fall away when the Council of Ministers amendment was accepted. So with that, sir, and with the lively debate we've had, I call for the appel.
As called for, I invite members to return to their seats. The vote is on the fourth amendment, brought by Deputy Alex Curtis, and I ask the greffier to open the voting and members to vote. Members have had the opportunity of casting their vote. Then I ask the greffier to close the voting. The amendment has been adopted. 21 votes pour, 19 votes contre, 1 abstention. Both sides, yes?
All three sides.
Those voting contre, the connotables of St Helier, St Bralard, St Peter, Grouville, St Juan, St Mary and St Saviour, and deputies Luce, Lehegara, Ayer, Gorst, Wall, Miles, Scott, Howell, Barbara Ward, Wilson, Stevenson and Andrews. Those voting pour, the connotab of St John, and deputies Southern, Labby, Taddier, Dublé, Morel, Robboard, Alves, Gardner, Moore, Mesick, Coles, Porre, Renner, Feltham, Jeune, Miller and Deputy Curtis online, and the connotab of St Lawrence abstained.
Very well. There is a further amendment lodged by Deputy Gardner. And there's an amendment also lodged to that amendment by the Minister for Health and Social Services. Deputy Gardner, do you accept the amendment lodged by the Minister?
Yes, sir. I do accept the amendment.
So can we take your amendment as amended by the
Yes,
Minister?
please.
Members agree? Then I ask the greffier to read the amendment as amended.
After paragraph B, insert the following new paragraph C and redesignate the existing paragraphs accordingly. C, that the personal possession and recreational use of cannabinol and cannabinol derivatives, as defined in the Misuse of Drugs Jersey Law 1978, should be decriminalised, with this provision included in the legislation to be brought forward under paragraph B, and to request the Minister for Health and Social Services to consult the Misuse of Drugs Advisory Council about reclassifying cannabinol and cannabinol derivatives, except where contained in cannabis or cannabis resin, from Class A controlled drugs to Class B controlled drugs, as defined within the same law.
Deputy Gardner.
Thank you. And as the Deputy Curtis, I would like to bring attention of the Assembly that this is debate in principle. and the Council of Ministers and the Minister accepted a Minister's amendment because I do believe it's important to go into the details and do consult with Misuse Advisory Council. The details will be brought back to the Assembly. Saying this, it's really the right time to address anomaly that we have in the law from 1978. From 1978, we moved a long way, and we are in different place. Lots changed since then. This amendment seeks to address a distinction that we have in Jersey law, which I think it's unnecessary, overcomplicates our cannabis legislation, makes a mockery of our drug classifications law, and gives a really sentencing appearance. We have more work for the labs when they need to understand what type oil, not oil. Jersey currently treats herbal cannabis and cannabis resin differently from the liquid cannabis oil, which is clearly just the difference of people who smoke and don't smoke. It's the smoking presentation, because cannabis and cannabis oil can be different strengths as well. So for being used for the same person, for the same purpose, but in different way. Currently, smokable dried cannabis flower and cannabis resin as listed as Class B controlled substance. But liquid cannabis extracts containing cannabidiol are classified as Class A drugs, which is the same category as heroin and crack cocaine. I suggest there is no reasonable justification for this distinction, and that cannabidiol liquid and derivatives should be given equal legal status to cannabis in dry leaf or resin form. And also, I don't think we should be really siding with smokable option if we're thinking about this. This change will align Jersey laws to those existing in the UK, as all cannabis products in the UK are Class B. And then we move away from criminalizing people found in possession of personal amounts of herbal cannabis and cannabis resin, and the difference in the penalties are very, very, very different, and they're important. And when I'm saying very important, we all passed in the Assembly in February, give the sanctioners powers to issue fines for small amounts of Class B and Class C drugs at parish halls. But its zero tolerance approach was maintained for Class A, partly substance, but it does include cannabis oil. Saying this, the exemption was made. What the exemption was made? The exception was made for cannabis oil contained in confectionery. Seriously, it is a revised guidelines for 2022, which allows such cases to be considered by Attorney General on case-by-case basis. I think it's really important that we'll not consider case-by-case basis. It needs to be very clear for everyone where you're standing, and this amendment bringing this, I think, clarity and making it less complicated than it is. I believe that acceptable personal possession limit for cannabidiol products could be set. It would allow them be also dealt at the parish level rather than resulting in criminal charges. I accepted an amendment from the Minister, as I believe that we need to get into small details, working with the professionals to clarify necessary elements of exclusion or discretion which should be considered given the varied nature of cannabis products. So, in quicker term, there can be no reasonable justification for treating cannabidiol and cannabidiol derivatives in the same manner as heroin and crack cocaine, which is what we are doing today. This proposition, this amendment, if adopted, will bring the handling of cannabis in Jersey in line with the UK legislation, with no distinction to make the classification between the herbal and non-herbal way. I move in my amendment. Thank you.
Is the amendment seconded?
Yes, sir.
Any member wish to speak on the amendment? Deputy Scott.
Sir, it's a point of order, actually. I just noticed that the amendment that's been accepted refers to, that C refers to legislation to be brought forward under paragraph B, and that the Council Minister's second amendment actually deletes reference to the legislation, talks about approaches. So I'm wondering, would this essentially be rewritten if the Council Minister's amendment was accepted?
The Council Minister's amendment has been accepted by Deputy Gardner, so the amendment must be read as qualified by the Council of Ministers amendment, and that's how it was read by the greffier.
This is the Minister for Health and Social Services
I beg your pardon, the Minister for Health.
And I'm talking about the Council Minister's amendment, which is the second amendment.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I had misunderstood what you were saying.
Thank you, sir.
One moment.
So can I clarify something?
Well, if
The difference between first and second, it has legislation, but it can be done by order by the minister himself. So it can be. So the Minister for Health would work with members to make this particular change of Class A and Class B. It's very clear that you're bringing just. It is different from the Council of Ministers amendment.
Yes, I accept that. It's just that your actual change refers to legislation, and there is an amendment to be considered that actually takes away the reference to legislation. So, yeah.
yes, Deputy Scott, I think you're correct in your interjection. The fact is that the proposition as it currently is has been, the Council of Ministers amendment has been accepted. Therefore, that is the form the proposition takes. To the extent that that is amended by this amendment, if the amendment is adopted, then that is what the proposition will then read as. So you're right in saying that the two, one will qualify the other.
Can we just clarify exactly what this will say then? Or are we waiting on?
Well, the greffier has read out the proposition as amended by the Council of Ministers because that was accepted by Deputy Coles. This is an amendment which, if it is accepted, will qualify the original proposition in its terms. In other words, whatever it says will become what the proposition has said. I'm not sure I can provide any greater clarification other than asking the greffier to read the proposition as if it were amended by this proposition, which it hasn't yet been. So it seems to me that is the case.
So have I missed something? And forgive me if I have, did the second amendment that was put forward by the Council of Ministers get accepted right
yes.
from? Okay, thank you. So that basically qualifies it. Right, okay,
yes.
Thank you.
And so now, if this is accepted, to the extent it qualifies the new form of the proposition, that's what the Assembly will be voting for.
Thank you.
Very well.
So could I make a request that members are circulated the wording of the now amended proposition as it would be if this amendment is accepted or not, so that we can understand what we're debating.
I'm not sure how practical that is for the Gref to do. At the moment, I'll just ask the greffier.
Yeah.
Greffier. Greffier indicates to me it can be done electronically in the next 5 minutes or so. Yes. Deputy Scott, did you have a speech that you wanted to make, or was it just that point of order?
No, thank you, sir. Just that point. Thank you.
Very well. Does any member wish to speak on... Well, just a moment. Hold on. Yes. Deputy Jean.
Thank you, sir. I will be brief because I wanted to just support Deputy Gardner in her amendment and reiterate what she has said, that this is not anything. She's not asking for anything massive or additional. It is actually being in line with UK law that is already there. Already, the UK have done the work behind that to understand what that means in effect. I know sometimes it sounds complicated, flowers and oils and things like this, and not all of us are experts in this if we don't utilise the substances. So it means that we need to. I just wanted to reiterate that this is not going above and beyond something that that the UK has done a lot of work behind already, and this would just be asking for going into line with the UK law, and I think this is a very reasonable amendment.
Very much, Deputy Coles.
Thank you, sir. I rise also to support this amendment, and I think it's important to note to members that Jersey's law in regards to derivatives and oils from cannabis are different, as we've established, from the UK, and this would bring it in line. We have at the moment where, and I'm trying to remember the exact percentage, it's either 3 or 4% THC that we are allowed within our cannabis products, our CBD products that are sold locally. The difference is, so we're talking, if a product which unfortunately is unregulated at the moment, so nobody can exactly quantify the percentage that will be in it. We're talking someone who buys something in absolute good faith that it is below the legal limit that is allowed in Jersey, that could then be tested, comes back and proves that actually it's not legal, and it actually is in a complete Class A, which is completely beyond their ability to know and understand in that first instance. So actually by including this, for this provision to be relooked at and addressed to make all cannabis and cannabis-related products the same under the eyes of the law, this is a very sensible and worthwhile amendment. The reason why I didn't accept this amendment is because I believe there is some misknowledge of these products within our assembly, and actually by having this opportunity to speak about them and actually air this in public, that it's good for our own education, because there are a lot of things in an ever-changing world that we have to try and keep up with. And for me as well, with these products, so the cannabinol derivative products, as I say, can include what are known as edibles, which have become very popular from the United States, which have found their way over here. And the question, again, that I ask members is do we think that someone who's using cannabis is something that they should be criminalised for? And actually, by bringing this down from a Class A, which is the most severe category of controlled substance that we have, down to a lesser one, is the right step forward. Thank you, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak on this amendment? Deputy Dublet.
Thank you, sir. Just to briefly voice my support for this amendment and to remind members that in the report there is a lot of research that has gone into this, and I'm confident that this is an evidence-based amendment and it should be supported today, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Tadier.
So it's just a comment that ministers seem to be very quiet at this point, and I'm not sure if that's because this amendment is so obvious that they're all going to vote for it, or if it's that they don't know what to make of it, or they're going to oppose it. So it would be really helpful at this point, I think, for some members in the Assembly, maybe to know whether this is a noddy, so to speak, or whether it's something which is dangerous. Because I know when we hear the words that the UK are doing this already, that can be traditionally a red rag to a bull for some traditional members, maybe not in this Assembly, we might have moved past that, but to other assemblies it would have been. And they might think, so simply just because the UK's done it doesn't mean it's a good argument to follow suit. But nonetheless, we do need to make sure that we are operating to a certain extent, I think, in sync with the wider area that we do come under for certain political purposes. So it would be good to hear from a Home Affairs Minister, for example. I don't want to put her on the spot, or even a former Home Affairs Minister in the Assembly, as to know what, because this does sound like it's eminently logical, doesn't it? Because if, like Deputy Coles said, that you have products out there which their prime purpose is therapeutic, shall we say, so you can get lots of body creams, face creams that would be CBD-based, which do have an unintentional amount of THC in there, and the purpose of those products is not to get a user of those products high, is to actually just, moisturise their skin, shall we say. It would be very strange if that person who inadvertently bought a product with a higher element of THC in it found that they were actually in possession of a Class A drug, when in fact they could just be in possession of a high a product with a high THC product, which is now being decriminalised if we go down this route, which would be, there'd be no consequences to that. So it does seem to me that what Deputy Gardner's come up with here is eminently sensible. It would put us in line with jurisdictions around us. And in the absence of hearing any arguments to the contrary, I'm presuming that we would just all support this, sir.
Vice Deputy Rob Ward.
Just briefly, sir, I think one of the reasons that ministers aren't speaking, there is a position for ministers on this. It's a free vote, it's a free vote anyway. So I stood on a manifesto to say decriminalise cannabis. That's for something later on in the debate. But I did want to say, I think this is an important thing to say, I really like the approach that Deputy Coles has taken to this debate, because it's in saying to somebody, especially this topic in our society, there are some topics in our society where we need to have a debate that is structured, that has come with an ending. I've never been a great fan of in-committee debates, so because there is no vote on them. And no matter what is said and written down, nothing actually has to happen. Today, we have to do something. It's been good to see members from across the Assembly bring amendments so that we can all consider them and all think about them carefully. I think that's a really good approach from the Deputy. And I was going to say it later, but I'll say it now, sir, particularly on this part. I've learnt a lot about this. I don't know a great deal about this area. I've read all of these. I've got the idea of what this amendment is doing, and it does seem logical to declassify derivatives in the same way as other products, because there's a huge market of products here, sir, which are ever increasingly growing. I think the main points I've got for the main debates when we finish all this and come to the main overall, because there are some points I think to be had here. I'm looking at this, and currently I will be supporting it because it just seems logical to do this thing, as with the last one, sir, in terms of cultivation. Thank you, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak on this amendment? No other member wishes to speak on the amendment? And I close the debate and call upon Deputy Gardner to respond.
I would like to say thank you for all members who spoke on my amendment. And as Deputy Ward said, it's logical to make it easy, streamlined. We have one category and we are not treating some products of the cannabis as a cocaine. There are really, really big difference. So for me, it's to bring us in line with lots of jurisdictions actually around the world that classify cannabis as one product with some exemption. And this is why I'm looking forward to working with the Health Minister to make sure that if exemptions are needed, they will be introduced with legislation that will be brought forward. So I'm asking for the appel, and thank you very much.
The appel is called for. Invite members to return to their seats. The vote is on Deputy Gardner's amendment to the proposition as amended by the Minister. I ask the Greffier to open the voting and members to vote. If members have had the opportunity of casting their vote, then I ask the Greffier to close the voting. The amendment has been adopted. 28 votes pour, 15 votes contre, no abstentions.
Do you want both sides? Sorry. Yes, please. So those voting contre, the connotabs of St Lawrence, St Brallard, Trinity, St Peter, Grouville, St Warne and St Saviour, and deputies Luce, Lahegara, Ayer, Gorst, War, Miller, Howell and Barbara Ward. Those voting for, the connotabs of St Martin and St John and St Mary, and deputies Southern, Labby, Tadier, Dublé, Morale, Ward, Alves, Gardner, Farnham, Moore, Mezek, Coles, Porray, Miles, Scott, Renouf, Feltham, Jern, Ferry, Kovac and Curtis, Wilson and Stevenson and Andrews, and Deputy Curtis online.
Very well. We now return to the debate on the main proposition as amended. Deputy Ferry.
Thank you, sir. Firstly, I'm glad to see that Deputy Coles has amended his own paragraph A to ensure that this does not criminalise children whilst decriminalising adults. I think this removes one of the areas that we could have spent a lot of time debating unnecessarily. It is, however, important that we consider how this proposition would affect children and young people. So there is no question that use of cannabis has potential health benefits. Some are positive effects, but there is also an accepted association between cannabis and psychosis for some users. The factors behind problematic or dependent use are more complex than just a substance's legal status. They pose significant risks if used by children and young people, particularly during adolescence. Looking at the impact of criminalisation, criminal records impact people's lives and potentially restrict their access to work, training, education and even travel. Criminalisation can be a direct barrier to accessing support for treatment for someone who has problematic use issues. There is no quality control or information about the potency of cannabis or its constituent substances, and this lack of regulation leaves users at the mercy of illicit markets if they are unable to get medicinal cannabis. Now looking at the impact of decriminalisation, evidence suggests that decriminalisation appears to have no significant effects on the age that people start using drugs. Decriminalisation is perceived by some as a poor alternative to legalisation, and so I'm glad that we'll be having that wider debate on both topics so that we can draw out all of the issues. We must, however, also consider the impact on our constitutional issues and compliance with UN conventions, as well as Jersey's international reputation. Customs agreements with the UK and Europe could also present a challenge, and there is potential to stimulate the illicit market in the UK and France if cultivation and supply is not addressed locally. Looking at Part B as amended, I'm glad that we've now got proposals as opposed to legislation being brought in by November 2025, and the proposals to also consider legalisation and regulation as opposed to just decriminalisation, as these are important factors. So the letter from the head of the probation service circulated to all states members highlights the many pitfalls of decriminalisation, but I think it is important that we vote for this proposition as amended so that we can conduct more research, consultation and discussion before firm proposals are brought back to this Assembly with a way forward for further debate. Thank you, sir.
Deputy Martin.
Thank you, sir. In my nomination speech for my previous role as Minister, I was asked by Deputy Mezek whether I agreed that the decriminalisation of cannabis is inevitable in Jersey. My answer was that as a former customs officer, a former senior leader in the police, a former member of the probation and aftercare service, and as an active criminologist, I had a bit of a cognitive dissonance around decriminalisation of cannabis. In my role as Minister, following the publication of A Change in Direction, Jersey's 10-year substance use strategy, I had envisaged an in-committee debate to take place at the end of January this year in order for the Assembly to be able to express their opinions on this topic. That would have enabled me to explore the many and complex issues and take action in slow time to follow the will of the Assembly in a measured and evidence-based manner. The new Minister chose not to follow that path, which is her right, but I fear that we're now faced with a minestrone of a proposition and various amendments that suggest the direction of travel should be towards decriminalisation in haste. So I still have a level of cognitive dissonance, but for different reasons. Some members will suggest that current drug policy is inappropriate, ineffective, and utterly out of date, and given the growing body of evidence that its continued criminalisation is harmful and leads to worse outcomes for those who involve themselves with that sort of thing, and they will choose to may not
choose to support this proposition. Others will have legitimate concerns about the potential increase in mental health issues associated with high levels of cannabis consumption and will choose not to support this proposition. Outside of Jersey, the debate over decriminalising cannabis has elicited a variety of opinions, along with perspectives across differing party lines and individual stances. While the UK government has been resistant to changing cannabis laws, citing potential health risks, the discussion among politicians and the public is evolving. The direction of travel is more focused towards the decriminalisation of cannabis, and there are increasing calls for reform based on health, economic and social justice considerations. I wholeheartedly agree that criminalising individuals for small amounts of cannabis is not desirable, and we're fortunate in Jersey to be able to effectively support that view using the Parish Hall inquiry system and carefully crafted guidelines from the Attorney General, which were both flexible and responsive. Those guidelines began in 1998 when the Attorney General endorsed the issue of a written caution for a first possession offence of less than 10 grams of cannabis for personal use, providing the person agreed to attend a drug awareness course. This has evolved slowly over the years, following advice from the Misuse of Drugs Advisory Council to include personal possessions of other substances and to increase the quantities. As has been previously mentioned, the latest legislative changes come with the enactment of the Crime Public Order Jersey law, which provides for a level 1 fine at Parish Hall for the repeat possession of up to 15 grams of herbal cannabis or resin. If we are to decriminalise, we need a structured approach. This should include limits on possession amounts, controls on where cannabis can be used, consumption limits while driving, etc. And any framework should ensure that decriminalisation does not lead to uncontrolled use, but creates a regulated environment where cannabis is safely and responsibly consumed. There's a salutary tale from Thailand, where in June 2022, cannabis was decriminalised. The Thai government established guidelines for cultivation, sale and medicinal use. Decriminalisation sparked debates within Thai civic society, with the traditional elements clashing with the modernists. The state developed education campaigns to help inform the public about safe and legal use of cannabis. The change in law, perhaps unsurprisingly, attracted more visitors, particularly those interested in cannabis tourism. Many cannabis cafes and well-being centres were established to serve locals and tourists alike, boosting the economy. There were various legal ambiguities and enforcement challenges, which are not altogether different to what the States of Jersey police are facing already in Jersey. And whilst cultivation and medical use were encouraged, the specifics of what constituted illegal recreational use were not always clear, leading to confusion and ad hoc enforcement. Earlier this year, the Prime Minister of Thailand announced plans to recriminalise cannabis by the end of this year. The aim is to address concerns about drug addiction and enforce stricter controls on cannabis use. This will reclassify cannabis as a drug, restricting its use to medical purposes only. Perhaps understandably, this decision has not gone down well in what has grown, excuse the pun, into quite an industry in Thailand. Thousands of small businesses will be affected. Significant protest and legal challenge are expected as people challenge this policy reversal. Now, I raise this example not because I think we shouldn't go down that route, but because we need to get it right for Jersey, and we need to think very carefully about all the consequences, intended and unintended. We need regulation that works for us and the characteristics of our small island community. It would be wholly unsatisfactory for us to get it wrong and have to reverse decriminalisation decisions, as is happening in Thailand. For me, this is not a conversation about a plant. It is a debate about social and criminal justice, public health and economics. There's a strong social justice argument for decriminalisation. A report by the charity Release has highlighted how current drug laws disproportionately affect minority communities and those from socially economic deprived backgrounds. They argue that decriminalisation could mitigate these disparities, but they also note that cannabis should be a regulated right. Decriminalising cannabis in Jersey might be a step towards a more just, healthy and economically robust society. It might allow us to address social inequalities, ensure public safety through regulation, and harness economic benefits for community reinvestment. But in my view, we need to move forward very carefully and very slowly, making rational decisions based on evidence. We need to acknowledge the complexities of change in this area. The potential changes in our constitutional relationship, already highlighted by Deputy Ferry, have also been highlighted in the letter from the Chair of the Misuse of Drugs Advisory Council. But there are other areas that need to be carefully considered. How will Jersey tackle increased usage and the risk of dependency? How will Jersey address the public health issues? How will Jersey deal with people who drive under the influence of cannabis, or look after our children, or pilot a boat or a plane, or operate on or care for patients? How will Jersey deal with the regulatory challenges, inconsistent quality in an illicit market? How will Jersey address the higher healthcare costs of treating cannabis-related issues? How will Jersey tackle the challenges faced by employers, where employees are cognitively challenged by the use of cannabis and therefore perhaps less productive or become a risk to the health and safety of the workplace? None of these areas are unsurmountable. Other countries seem to have achieved an appropriate balance. Switzerland is currently piloting several projects to explore the impacts of regulated cannabis sales. The goal is to gather data on the impacts of legal cannabis markets. Like Jersey, the Swiss approach emphasises harm reduction, and like Jersey, their approach is characterised by a pragmatic and evidence-based strategy that seeks to balance public health concerns with the realities of cannabis in a modern society. We should also note that the Swiss government supports extensive research on cannabis use and effects in their community. There are no shortcuts to this for Jersey. We need to do our own research to help us develop policies that work for Jersey, and not assume because it works in Switzerland or doesn't work in Thailand that it would be the same here. And that will have a cost. If this proposition is successful, I should be interested to see what level of funding is proposed in the government plan. I believe we need a rational, compassionate and evidence-based approach to cannabis decriminalisation. I think there are some parallels with this debate and that of assisted dying, where there was an in-principle decision from the Assembly, followed by a very detailed report and proposition to be followed by a draft law. Today, it seems to me that we're at the in-principle stage. I hope that the government will have sufficient time and resource to provide us with a similarly detailed report and proposition, informed and supported by a similar level of public consultation, and dare I say it, a citizens' jury process. So, for similar reasons that I stated around assisted dying, I will support the amendments and the approach put forward by the Council of Ministers, and I look forward to their detailed proposals at the end of next year, and very much hope that the questions I have raised here today will be addressed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Barbara Ward.
Thank you, sir. And following on from Deputy Miles, my original speech had an awful lot of things that you've actually expressed, so I thank you for that. So I've shortened mine. Sir and members, I'd like to thank the Chief Minister for providing us with a free vote and to be able to speak on this proposition. But I'm actually very worried about this proposition and the amendments being brought to the Assembly for several reasons. I feel some have actually been shared already. I feel it's been brought far too early for debate, albeit it's not just an agreement to introduce, but an agreement in principle to explore. Much more research in terms of health implications to individuals and families, the healthcare costs, and the reputational damage and its impact this type of drug decriminalisation introduction could have on individuals in the island itself. During my time as a nurse working in the mental health area, I have seen and cared for many people affected by cannabis recreational usage, and at times cannabis being used as a self-medicating behaviour. This has led to the user to further suffer from addiction and long-term mental health problems. Whether the cannabis has been attained off the streets or via the medicinal prescribing route. I'm horrified to see that there's 6% of the population, this is under a medicinal cannabis usage. The percentage of people who is off the streets, we don't know what that percentage is, sir. I've consulted with other healthcare professionals who are directly involved with caring for people who have been, and some severely affected. The impact of subsequent ill health has placed enormous suffering for the patient, their families, and the increased pressures on the mental health teams, and that's now. And if we open up this decriminalisation, how much more will we need in the mental health department? These health professionals, like me, are very concerned about this proposition. When we look at about the actual prescribing of medicinal cannabis, the actual subjects are actually very small. We look at intractable nausea and vomiting, chronic pain, spasticity, and severe treatment-resistant epilepsy. Cannabis is not a cure-all for everything. But when you look, it's very, very small is what it's being prescribed for. Anyway, sir, and I'm sure we, as an Assembly, all we want is for people to be healthy, safe, and harm-free. Before we as an Assembly ever introduce or agree to items like to this proposition, we must ensure and be 100% confident that all the legal and reputational implications, and especially the health-related avenues, have had the proper checks and balances explored before we put anything in place. Sir, I cannot support this proposition, and as I feel it's wrong at this time. And I urge members to reject this proposition as presented. Thank you, sir, and members for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Connettabs and Saviour.
Thank you, sir. I'm delighted to follow the last two speakers whose opinions I cannot disagree with. I do actually work with Deputy Coles, and we agree to disagree, I think, putting it mildly. So I have in my constituency of St Saviour 3 families whose children's lives have been blighted by the use of cannabis. And I'm well aware, and there's people with more medical knowledge than myself, that if one has mental health issues, that prolonged use of cannabis can push you over the edge. I do not wish to criminalise people. That's the last thing I want to do. But it's to do with messaging, that people will think that if something is no longer illegal, it is by default legal. I think that's the message that goes out there. That I find it quite bizarre that not 2 weeks ago we were lining up to criticise the use of vapes and children because it was very unhealthy for them. And yet we're actually discussing decriminalising cannabis. I will be voting against this proposition, sir, and I urge members to do likewise. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So I'd like to speak on Section B, and in particular 2 bullet points: restrictions on driving under the influence of cannabis and relevant roadside capacity tests. So infrastructure is already working with Justice and Home Affairs at both officer and ministerial level. I've already signed a ministerial decision, sir, and officers are currently working on the draft law instructions, and we expect law drafting to commence in Q4 this year. The working group of officers have an agreed approach to update legislation to set drug limits in legislation to support enforcement of driving whilst unfit through drugs. The expected time frame is 6 to 9 months, but we won't be able to tie this down confidently until law drafters have had a chance to look at the detail and understand the requirements. Updated legislation will give the police powers to undertake roadside drug testing, much like with breath testing now. At the moment, when charging, the police have to rely on police evidence of seeing unfit driving, and whilst they can have the forced medical examiner take blood from a suspect that gives levels of drug use, both THC and other drugs, because there are currently no limits set in Jersey legislation, they have to rely on UK limits as their threshold for charging. Sadly, sir, driving under the influence of drugs is a growing issue on this island. The working group have done a lot of research across other jurisdictions who do have limits and testing in legislation, but applied local knowledge to define what the limits should be, especially as in Jersey we know people who run with a baseline level of THC in their blood because of legitimate prescription of cannabis. So I agree with a lot of what Deputy Miles said in what I thought was an excellent speech. We need to explore things fully and we need more information, but I will be supporting the proposition as amended. Thank you.
Deputy Jean.
Thank you. So I just had a question for the SG, actually. Of course, we're just talking about there seems to be a two-tier system in Jersey. Obviously, you've got medical, those who are allowed to use cannabis through a prescription. But what happens if the prescription expires and those people still have a quantity of cannabis? Are they then considered that they're still under their prescription, or should they have used it all up before their prescription ended?
Well, the way it works is that the medicinal cannabis constitutes a carve-out from the criminal law by ministerial order. You don't commit an offence of possession of cannabis if you come within the criteria. The criteria for users is that you have a medical prescription. If you don't have a medical prescription, or you don't have a valid medical prescription, then my view is that you are engaging the criminal law because you are in possession of cannabis out with the regulations set by the medicinal cannabis scheme.
Sorry, and just a final question, because I don't really know. So you were saying there's a scheme, but there's not regulation to define what constitutes when that prescription should be applied to,
well, I think
given to people or not?
It must be a question of fact. The scheme works in a way that, by regulation, things which would otherwise be criminal are not. So, for example, if you have a ministerial licence to import cannabis, you don't commit an offence of importation. If you have a supply of cannabis from a supplier who has a licence, then no offence of supply is committed. If you are in possession of cannabis pursuant to a medical prescription by a doctor, then you don't commit the offence of simple possession. If you don't have a valid prescription, then you don't, it seems to me, come within the carve-out, and it would seem to me on first principles that you commit the offence of simple possession of cannabis.
Did you wish to speak, or was it, Deputy Jones, did you wish to make a speech, or was that... very well. Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Wilson.
Thank you, sir. So whilst some may argue that decriminalisation of cannabis is a step forward towards personal freedom and will bring economic benefit, the potential risks and consequences of such a decision are enormous, and it does beg the question as to why we are discussing this in isolation. A proposition like this takes away the importance of considering such a complex issue in the round. If this proposition were to be supported, this Assembly will be responsible for unleashing what I would consider a harmful experiment regarding the mental and physical health of the people of Jersey. Why would we want to do that? Cannabis is being smoked, not vaporised, all over the island, and we have so little data on the consequences of what is already taking place. It accounts for the highest proportion of global drug use harm. Those in favour of decriminalisation argue that current harm reduction approaches are not working and that criminalising people for small amounts of possession is wrong. However, I would urge members to look at the meta-analysis, which is an umbrella study of all of the studies and systematic reviews done in the world on the harms and benefits of cannabis, which was published in the British Medical Journal in August 2023. This was undertaken by an international panel of experts which could not have a greater level of international consensus. They concluded that cannabis is a seriously harmful drug, and if its use is increased, it can only lead to more terrible consequences. The analysis found that the more liberal the country is when it comes to making cannabis available, the more people will use it. At a recent European Psychiatric Congress, delegates heard that the highest consumption is in countries where cannabis has been decriminalised and or legalised. If the opportunity is there for people to use it more frequently and in higher doses, harm is increased. The quantity of cannabis smoked every time people use it is associated with bad outcomes. And we know harms are emerging from the current prescribing which goes on in what is considered to be industrial quantities in medicinal cannabis clinics, way above recommended limits and to all sorts of people who don't need it. So why, given that we're doing that and with no idea of the consequences, would we want to increase it any more by decriminalising possession and cultivation? The gap we have is that Jersey has not commissioned any recent research to understand the impact of cannabis in the island, but a few pointers from the European countries give us cause for concern. Decriminalisation may lead to a perception that cannabis use is risk-free, potentially increasing its usage among vulnerable populations such as teenagers and individuals with a history of substance abuse. You've only got to ask any psychiatrist in Jersey on their experience of dealing with this, and they will tell you our mental health inpatient wards are stuffed with people who have been smoking cannabis, and these are mainly younger adults. Are we seriously considering adopting a proposition that has the potential to create the conditions where dependency or addiction to cannabis will increase in real terms? Decriminalising cannabis for personal use and cultivation will encourage people to take more cannabis. We should consider this in the same as we consider the harms associated with alcohol use. A lot of people can get away with consuming a small amount, but the more one drinks, the greater the consequences. It's the same for cannabis. We don't encourage people to drink 200 units of alcohol a week, so why would we therefore encourage people to use more cannabis more frequently by opening it up to a decriminalisation environment? Cannabis use in the island is now compounded by the ease with which access to medicinal cannabis is developed in the island. And while some may choose to deny this, we know that a lot of this is being smoked and not vaporised. How do we know this? Because the people who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis are telling us that what we've done is we've introduced something which is wide open to abuse. People are smoking flower for all sorts of things, which make no sense from a medicinal perspective. When you look at the evidence in the meta-analysis, which does show where cannabis is beneficial and where it is not, based on what we know about how people use cannabis in the island so far, we can see that people are already getting more than they actually need. A prescribing audit completed recently showed people are being prescribed medicinal cannabis 3 times above the recommended dose of 5 to 7 milligrams a day. Early estimates suggest that on average, people in Jersey are being prescribed 17 milligrams a day. And when we adopt these limits, then we know that 40% of users smoking at that rate will become addicted. Daily or almost daily use is a most concerning pattern of use. Using cannabis more than 4 times a week is considered high use, and there is European consensus on this. Anything above 7 milligrams a day, whether smoking it or taking it medicinally, is dangerous. Anecdotally, we also know that people are reselling medicinal cannabis to recoup the cost of a prescription. What is being sold is being smoked, and we're collecting absolutely no data and no information on the relationship between medicinal cannabis and how this is being used for recreational purposes. Until we carry out these studies, why would we be taking more steps to decriminalise use now and, worse, encouraging people to grow it? This drug ruins people's brains, and that's the opinion of world experts, libraries of research which shows it actually damages young people's brains, and yet we want to bring in more easy ways to obtain it without looking at the impact on the island's youth so far. This, in my view, has no basis for making any rational decisions on decriminalising this harmful substance. Studies have shown that despite increasing acceptance of cannabis use, especially among adolescents and young adults, it does have detrimental effects on brain development. Regular use, as we know, is associated with impairments in memory, attention, cognitive function, which can lead to poorer academic performance and lower life satisfaction. Moreover, its use is linked to mental health disorders, as we've seen. We simply cannot afford to be frying the brains of young people and opening them up to uncontrolled supply of high-potency cannabis. It's suggested that in the evidence that 9% of users will become dependent on cannabis. This rate increases to about 17% for those who start using in their teens, and between 25 and 50% for daily users. It will lead to increased availability and social acceptance, thereby escalating use and subsequently addiction rates. So while the decriminalisation of cannabis might seem like a progressive step towards individual liberty, we must consider the broader implications on public health, societal well-being, and the potential for increased addiction and mental health issues. The potential risks and costs to society are simply too significant to ignore. On that basis, sir, I believe we do have more work to do on this to fully understand what impact this drug is having and will have in our island community. Any further liberalisation can only be considered in the context of a deeper understanding of the issues. We must adopt the principle of having reliable, respected and independently produced data to drive and inform our decisions in this area, information the public can trust and expect states members to utilise to inform this work. It would be my view, sir, that the state should fund and complete an independent public health assessment of the impact of cannabis use and prescribing in the island before any further steps are taken to even consider decriminalising it or bringing proposals forward to do so. So I fear this is an irresponsible proposition and one I'm afraid I cannot support. The argument that decriminalisation will reduce the burden on the criminal justice system or not have any further detrimental health impact in our community is not entirely accurate. We have to look at the levels at which serious harm occurs in the island, and we will only know this when we start collecting the data and legislating effectively. We've so little research and curiosity about what the situation is in the island already, both from a positive and a negative perspective. If this proposition is supported, we're about to unleash even more harms without knowing the scale of the harm we've already created. This is the consequences of it. And I would urge members to reject the proposition until we know more about what we're dealing with, how we will deal with it in the interest of reducing harm and protecting the brain and the brain health of young people in the islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Luce.
Thank you, sir, and I'm pleased to be able to follow Deputy Wilson. I can't disagree with one word that she said. For me, sir, this is another step in a direction I don't believe this island wants to take. It's the thin end of the wedge. And I say that because during my time on the youth panel, where I do 2 sessions, I saw the ruin of young people's brains that the deputies just referred to. Even if it's a small percentage of people who smoke cannabis for the first time, it surely isn't something we could agree to help people to do, to ruin young people's lives. And I think forward to my grandchildren potentially going to homes of their friends where those parents may be growing and smoking cannabis without knowing the effects that it may have on my grandchildren. I certainly could not agree to do that. Like Deputy Miles, I've read the advice that we've had from some people that I have the greatest of respect for. I've considered what an island that centres on tourist or cannabis tourism would mean for us. It certainly isn't one that I would want to promote. Would we want people to come here solely for that reason? I've thought about the intended, but more importantly, the unintended consequences of what we might be doing here. And I say that, sir, because of the mess that is the prescribed cannabis situation here on the island. A well-meaning backbench proposition that came forward and got adopted without enough research, without enough data and without enough thought has left us in a real mess, whereas deputies have already referred to, we know people are being prescribed far more than they should and are getting prescriptions for the weakest of reasons. So I would say this to members, two wrongs do not make a right. Please don't be deceived by thinking this proposition will help the prescribed cannabis situation in the island. It will only make it worse. I have asked them to think about young people and the effects it might have on their brains. And for that reason alone, I will wholeheartedly be voting against this proposition.
Deputy Mosek.
Well, thank you, sir. And it's precisely because of my thoughts of the young people of Jersey that I'll be voting in support of this proposition and playing what will be my small part in helping to end a policy that is failing them and failing the island as a whole. And I simply cannot understand how, after years of failure of this policy, not just in Jersey but other parts of the world, how we can maintain support for a system that isn't working. So the Deputy Miles spoke of her cognitive dissonance in her position on this, and I have to say, having listened to her excellent speech and the logical way that she reached her conclusion in it, I didn't detect any of that cognitive dissonance, but I have detected a significant amount of it in the three speakers that have spoken against this proposition, whose conclusion is that cannabis is bad, therefore we should make the situation for those who are using it even worse by criminalising them, something which as of yet has done nothing to stop them taking it in the first place, is not an education-based response, is not a health-based response. It is to simply say, if you're doing this, you will have a criminal conviction thrown at you and all of the consequences that arise from that, which don't lead to anything positive. I was amused by Deputy Wilson's suggestion that we were potentially going to make this decision without data and that we ought to be seeking to have more data in order to make a reasoned decision on this. I think there's two problems with that. The first is that there are plenty of countries around the world that are already doing it, so I don't see why Jersey ought to reinvent the wheel in that sense. But secondly, and here's the major flaw in her position, sir, we want to gather data on how people who are currently engaging in criminal activity are behaving. Well, I'm sure they'll all be queuing up to volunteer their experiences, knowing that they'll be admitting to committing criminal offences. Of course, you cannot collect that data because nobody's going to step forward and volunteer it because of the consequences that could otherwise arise from it. But where I think is the worst inconsistency in the response against this proposition, about talking about the negative health effects that cannabis can and does have on people, is how this standard seems not to apply to all of the other substances that are freely available to us that can have a devastating impact on people's lives. Sir, alcohol can be extremely dangerous and have horrendous health effects on those who either consume too much of it or those who are of whatever natural predisposition that it has a significantly bad effect on them. Of course, most people consume alcohol completely responsibly and can enjoy it and won't suffer negative health effects as a result of it because they do so in moderation. But excessive use of it can be devastating, can cause all sorts of diseases. It can obviously severely impact on your judgment and how you behave when you drink too much of it. And some people, of course, suffer from alcoholism and all of the consequences that leads to as well. And yet, the moment you turn 18, you can go to any shop you like and buy as much of it as you like and can afford and consume it as quickly as you like with very little regulation of that, and for that alone, you won't be criminalised. So that is clearly a gross inconsistency in approach there, which doesn't seem to... Those who say that we have the right approach on cannabis don't seek to impose that same approach on alcohol. That, to me, is cognitive dissonance. Sir, sugar is bad for you. If you consume too much of that, you can become obese and you can have all sorts of health effects as a result of that too. But we wouldn't, of course, criminalise anyone who baked cakes and put sugar in them, or Jersey Wonders, of course. That would be an absurd thing to propose. They obviously have very good effects on people as well. Sir, the proposition as it now stands, having been amended, and in particular the amendment by the Council of Ministers that has added a list of other considerations that ought to be put in this, before saying, as well as saying, that proposals will come back to the Assembly, means that the decision we make today is not one which we can say at this moment in time is a flawed decision or that will automatically lead to all of these unforeseen circumstances. Because if we vote for this proposition, we will not be decriminalising cannabis today. We'll be taking the first step on the journey towards decriminalising it by agreeing in principle that the criminalisation of people who simply enjoy a joint from time to time in the same way that many of us enjoy a pint of beer or a glass of wine is not a sensible approach when it comes to harm reduction or dealing with those who have issues with substance use. It's to agree that basic point of principle and then ask the government to do the necessary work that it needs to do to come up with some detailed framework that includes all of those other issues like how the substance is dealt with in the presence of children, how it's dealt with if people are trying to consume it before driving, and how social supply might work, and all of those other issues, which will come back to the Assembly in a detailed form, allowing us, at that point, to determine whether that framework does resolve those issues to our satisfaction, or whether at that point it can be thrown out. This proposition today is merely to take the first step in that journey and agree that the practice of possessing small amounts of cannabis, perhaps growing some of it your own, and smoking it or using it, should not be a criminal offence, because criminalising it, as we can see from all of the other jurisdictions around the world and in Jersey, is not putting off people using it. It's not convincing people to step forward and engage with the authorities if they get caught up in other negative aspects of the illegal drug trade around that. It simply takes up time and resources and puts people, many of whom will be moderate, responsible users of cannabis in the same way that most people are moderate and responsible consumers of alcohol, puts their lives through a whole load of extra hassle that doesn't lead to any benefits to them. So my manifesto said that I would support the decriminalisation of cannabis. I wholeheartedly do that, and thank Deputy Coles for bringing forward a proposition that seeks to take us in that direction. And I hope members will take the opportunity today, having examined what is happening in the world around us, that the move towards decriminalisation is inevitable, and if this Assembly says no to it, it'll come back in the next one and will probably be accepted at that point as well. But it enables us to take hold of that journey today, do that work to come up with the more detailed proposals for how it will work, and we'll get there eventually anyway. And sooner rather than later, sir, because in the meantime, those who are being forced through the criminal justice system for using cannabis are, in my belief, suffering an injustice that they don't deserve and for no public benefit as a result of it.
Deputy Hull.
Thank you, sir. Whilst I appreciate that some people see nothing wrong with cannabis, just a joint, nothing wrong. You can chill out with it, become happy, giggly, chatty. I worry because there is another side. Cannabis can cause cognitive impairment and serious mental health issues. And it's the higher the percentage of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinoid, known as THC, the higher percentage, the higher the risk. Cannabis is particularly harmful for the developing brain of up to 25-year-olds, not 18, as was mentioned in the original proposition, and it is harmful to the developing fetus. People with a history of ongoing severe mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, severe depression, or any brief psychosis, and those with first-degree relatives with any of those conditions may be vulnerable to developing them with cannabis use. There is some evidence that people in certain ethnic minority groups may also be more at risk of harm, and research shows that it can cause damage to people's vascular systems, hearts, and has been linked with cancer. Cannabis can cloud your senses of judgment. The effects can differ depending on things like how potent your cannabis was, how you took it, and how much you've used in the past. It might make your senses stronger. Colours might seem brighter. Sounds may seem louder. But it can twist your sense of time. You don't turn up for work. There's no sense of urgency. Your motor skills can be affected, making driving and operating machinery dangerous. It can lower your inhibitions, so you may have unsafe sex or take other chances. Anxiety is the most commonly reported negative effect, with up to 30% of recreational users experiencing intense anxiety and/or panic attacks after smoking cannabis. Some get full-blown paranoia. And you can get hooked. About 40% of people who are prescribed cannabis will become addicted. This means you can't stop, even if it harms your relationships, school, job, health, or finances. When a lovely young friend of mine was at art school, she smoked cannabis. She was one of the unlucky ones. She developed schizophrenia. Her life and the life of her family were wrecked. She could no longer function. It was and is awful. Her schizophrenia did not go away when she stopped using cannabis. It continues to this day. As a government, we have a duty to protect islanders and to promote healthy lifestyles. We need regulation of our clinics and prescribing, restrictions on false advertising, and we need to send the right public health messages. We already have a problem with our mental health services being overstretched. We all received advice from the Misuse of Drugs Advisory Council, a group which includes our law officers, the chief pharmacist, head of customs, doctors and others, highlighting some of the reasons that we should not be going down this route of decriminalisation of cannabis at this time. I urge you all to listen to their advice and vote against this proposition. Thank you, sir.
Deputy Scott.
Thank you, sir. When I stood for election, I did not do so to make popular decisions, but to make responsible decisions. Deputy Miles and Deputy Wilson have stressed the need to make responsible decisions. So far, the only part of the raft of propositions, which Deputy Miles has described as a minestrone, and I was tempted to describe as a dog's dinner, the only part that I have found myself inclined to support is paragraph B, as amended by the Council of Ministers. And even then, I have my reservations. Because around the Council of Ministers table, we have constant, intense discussions about funding priorities. And outside this chamber, some of the public question whether we are addicted to supporting the funding of nice-to-haves at the expense of services we really need right now that are making people suffer in most serious ways. I find it almost an insult to find myself being asked to support a proposition that talks about supporting the use of a narcotic for recreational purposes. Well, can't people find something better to do? I have no doubt, and I really don't, that the manner in which the possession and confiscation of cannabis is regulated needs to be reviewed. But even now, I believe we should be encouraging islanders to stay away from the stuff unless they have a good reason to do it, to relieve them from pain. We should not be trivialising the use of a narcotic. Because let's be clear, that's what we are discussing here. A narcotic which can be contrasted with alcohol, which alcohol is declassed as a depressant. But this substance induces mental lethargy or stupor. It alters consciousness and is potentially addictive. And as already has been mentioned, in excessive doses, it can cause stupor, coma, or psychosis. How does a user know how this narcotic is going to affect that user? And do we just say, oh, go and find out? We already have a level of decriminalisation and a level of support for those who merit prescription of cannabis for medicinal purposes, although I accept that needs to be looked at in order to avoid abuse in many ways. If we were to put cannabis on a par with alcohol, it would be served from licensed premises, perhaps upon assessment of the impact on the individual user. But this is not being proposed here. Responsible decisions are informed decisions. States members weren't invited to attend a drug awareness course before debating this proposition. And I doubt many cannabis users do before using cannabis. Who should be using cannabis? What should states members be approving that is likely to minimise harm to both the public and the user in the greatest amounts, of course? Are we just playing to a few individuals? What really is going on here? It's important that states members understand the effects of THC, which I believe that different members have already addressed. But I don't believe they've mentioned all of them. The higher likelihood of developing bronchitis when a person smokes, a weakened immune system, aggravation of existing lung conditions, impaired judgment. That's great if you're employing people. Let's improve the island's productivity that way. Delayed reactions to stimuli. Oh, how many drivers on the road? Temporary paranoia and hallucinations. Interference with brain development. Not just amongst teenagers, by the way. I've looked at these medical reports because I tried to inform myself. Under 25-year-olds. That's most of your likely targets, your likely market. You know, how come we're kind of trying to stop people from harming themselves in other ways? Increased or possibly decreased, because it depends on the users, depression symptoms. I personally have come across cannabis users, and some have fine, become more creative. Others, terrible, realise they become gibbering idiots and really slow at communicating. Now, ironically, and then I come back to the under 25. So one of the ways in which this proposition has been amended is not to criminalise children for being in possession of a narcotic drug. But do we necessarily want under 25-year-olds even to have it? So the carte blanche we effectively would be giving to such people to possess a substance for their personal use would mean the community paying the cost with their impeded brain development and possibly aggravated health issues. In the UK, drivers caught speeding are offered attendance at speed awareness courses as an alternative to criminalisation criminalisation. What about drug awareness courses for those found in possession of non-prescribed cannabis? That could be a way of decriminalising. Only how many times are you going to do that? So really, when it comes to this very kind of glib suggestion about decriminalising cannabis, what on earth do we mean by that? And that's why paragraph B I find preferable and covers all the bases more than A and C, which seems to just say, yeah, it's okay, decriminalise. We also should be considering the working adults whose productivity can be severely impeded by the use of non-prescribed cannabis and the cost to their employers. The island's roads already have a disproportionately high number of road accidents, and the speed of reaction of any road user under the influence of cannabis is affected. Now, we can talk about the roadside tests and this sort of thing, but how many joints can an individual smoke in order to make that individual a dangerous driver? And how long will the THC remain in the person's system? Does the individual know? Do states members know? Because I believe not, because the answer very much depends on the profile of the individual user, with many variables to consider. That includes how much cannabis they use, how often they exercise, the type of exercise, their eating habits and metabolism, their body fat ratio, the particular strain of cannabis they use. Maybe I should mention the trend in the United States of cannabis being laced with fentanyl, by the way, because I believe there is a case for enabling general testing of drugs in possession of individuals for their protection, as well as to require them to give information regarding the supplier. I have a different kind of vision of decriminalisation, if you like, perhaps from some. So, and according to American Addiction Centres, a person can expect cannabis to remain in their body for the following times: hair 90 days, urine 3 days, saliva 48 hours, blood 36 hours, but it all depends on that individual. So here we go, we say, yeah, possessibility of cannabis, and we'll do the roadside checks. But really, we should be educating ourselves and these people before even going down that route. I don't believe that this States Assembly, all the individuals in it, are educated enough in this. And I mean that most respectfully. But I believe that there is a lot more to be learning before we just simply glibly say, yeah, it's like alcohol. I come back to this point about what we really should be using funds, because this will cost money, developing this regulation. I know there are other things that I haven't mentioned, hopefully other people will. The experts, people mention the experts, the Drugs Advisory Council, who actually not only have raised some policing issues, but also constitutional issues. We can't be glib about those. And I believe that really, if we're going to support this in any shape or form, if I am, then I'll be looking to support paragraph B and paragraph B alone. But even now, I'm still thinking about it. Thank you, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? Decriminalisation.
Thank you, sir. And I don't think it's right, sir, to impugn somebody's motives for bringing the proposition, sir. One of the things that has been mentioned is that people are criminalised for the possession of cannabis, and have been. And I think there are many people who would agree in this assembly that that is too much. They have their lives ruined by convictions for possession of cannabis, sir. And so I think that is a very good reason to bring such a proposition to the assembly, and to suggest that it is in some way not appropriate to bring this proposition to the assembly, I think is deeply inappropriate in itself. It is a perfectly reasonable proposition, and it's one that the states will opine upon and decide one way or the other. But the Deputy Coles has the right to bring this proposition, and I back him entirely in doing so, sir. Sir, the point that I really want to get to is the inequality that users of cannabis have faced all their lives compared to users of alcohol. And that, for me, is at the core of this whole issue. And so, again, the idea of using terms such as glib, not at all. This is a perfectly rational proposition brought for perfectly rational reasons. asking the states to discuss in a perfectly rational way the issues at hand. And so, sir, and I know we've had former health ministers talk about experts, and we've heard other people talk about experts, etc. And yes, cannabis can have a harmful effect on some individuals, sir. And I, for one, definitely believe cannabis should be kept out of the hands of teenagers and younger than that, for sure. But you don't do that by just prohibiting something. What prohibiting does, as we know time and again, and has been mentioned in this, the supposed war on drugs, Ronald Reagan's famous war on drugs, which has been going on for decades and decades, as an abject failure. An utter, utter failure. All it has done is destroy societies. The war itself has destroyed societies. And that war starts with the prohibition, the total prohibition on something such as cannabis. When the harms of cannabis are time and time again shown to be vastly less than the harms of alcohol. And that's the inequality at the heart of this proposition and why I'll be supporting this proposition. Because I know there are plenty of members of this Assembly who will be voting against this proposition, but who will be happily having a drink tonight. And they will be happily having a drink tonight in a way that discriminates against those people who prefer not to have a drink, but would prefer to use cannabis in this case, sir. And they will not be. People have mentioned driving. Yet you shouldn't drive whilst intoxicated, full stop. And I did speak to one constable who may be voting against this because of the issues around testing, and I understand that. That's, again, a very rational reason to vote against this. But alcohol is 14 times... someone drinking alcohol is 14 times more likely to be involved in an accident than if they weren't drinking alcohol. Someone who has used cannabis is twice as likely. It's still too much, but it's 7 times less than alcohol. Cannabis does not cause violence. It does not cause social violence. It does not cause vandalism. These are all things associated with alcohol. I've got 2 studies in front of me here, sir, one from the UK and one from Germany. And it's really interesting. The UK study, using a multi-criteria analysis, shows that alcohol is the most harmful drug in British society. That is above heroin, that is above crack cocaine, that is above all other drugs. The most harmful drug in British society is alcohol. In Germany, it's only the 4th most harmful drug. And I believe that's because of cultural differences between them. Heroin, crack cocaine, and so on are more harmful in Germany than alcohol is. But alcohol comes in 4th. In a list of 30 drugs, including prescription drugs, including codeine, in Germany, cannabis comes in 16th. That's for social and individual harm. Alcohol comes in 4th. In the British study, which had, I believe, 15 different drugs, cannabis came in 8th, alcohol 1st. And that's, for me, the reason why I will support this proposition. I just do not believe it is right to criminalise people when society, we as the states, actually tax alcohol. Actually, as Minister for Sustainable Economic Development, I have a constant ongoing dialogue with the hospitality sector about duty, about the taxation of alcohol. Obviously, they wish to supply alcohol to their patrons, and I wish them to do so successfully and safely and securely. But I do all of that whilst at the same time knowing that we as a society criminalise cannabis, which is a far less dangerous drug. Empirically shown time and again to be far less dangerous than alcohol. And that, for me, is why I will support this proposition, and I ask states members to as well. The only way you will help with people who have problems with cannabis, who have psychosis with cannabis, who the only way you will stop it being sold on to youngsters, etc., is by regulating. And the only way you can regulate is by legalisation or decriminalisation. It starts with decriminalisation. That's the only way you can regulate. To keep it prohibited means you cannot regulate. It drives it into the hands of criminal gangs. And as a result, hey-ho, the States Assembly is effectively enabling the criminalisation and the criminal economy to take place. Let's take it out of the criminal economy. Let's take it into the legal economy where we can have a grip on it. That is the message that I would like to give the Assembly today. Let's not keep this criminalisation of people going, people who are not harming our society. And it's only by getting rid of that shame and that stigma that is attached to it that those people then, those who are struggling, will then be able to go and feel that they can seek help for their own personal struggles. But at the moment, again, we stop that happening because we make it shameful that you are using cannabis. And that's all wrong, and that's all entirely linked to the criminalisation. So I thank Deputy Coles for bringing this proposition. I thank all those, the Council Ministers, Deputy Gardner and Deputy Alex Curtis, for their amendments, which I think were all worthy amendments. And I say, let's do this piece of work to show all islanders that we want them to be able to live free, safe lives. Free because they get to choose what they want to put in their own bodies. Safe because we get to regulate and make sure it is safe. If we don't do that, all we are doing is making sure that money and cannabis stays in the hands of criminal gangs, and we make sure that islanders do not have freedom to choose what they put in their own body. And those are two things that I don't think we should be doing. So, sir, I thank you for the time. I shall certainly be supporting this proposition.
Very much, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Rob Ward.
Thank you, sir. And I'll just take this fan out because I think it's making noise. I'm very pleased to follow that because I was sort of putting ideas together in my head. So much has been said about this proposition. I start from a position, sir, of saying that I have an issue with cannabis and medical cannabis and so on, and it comes from a scientific point of view in terms of the lack of evidence about its use, about its effectiveness. But there's a problem there, and the reason we have that problem is not enough research has been done, not enough research has been done in the World Health Organization and in medical background of these things to see whether some of the claims made are true or not. And the reason that has happened is partly, and I think in the majority of cases, because it is an illegal drug. And so therefore it is extremely difficult to research and it's extremely difficult to gather evidence. So a lot has been said about young people and cannabis. So there are young people who are being criminalised early on in their careers as human beings, let's put it that way, because they have decided to try cannabis because of their friends, because of peer pressure, because it might just be something they want to do. And if we are to criminalise these young people for doing something which is relatively harmless, then we have to recognise there are consequences long-term into their lives that, one, not deserved, and two, there is no evidence to say that they should be deserved. So I wrote down some of the things that are really that we should stay away from. We should stay away from alcohol. We should stay away from cigarettes. We should stay away from fatty foods. They're really bad for us. We should stay away from high sugar foods. We should stay away from painkillers such as codeine, massively addictive. Look at what's happened in America. But we don't stay away from those things, sir. We've accepted them as a society and all the problems that have gone with them, it seems. But what we have done is we've taken one drug that is used recreationally and medicinally and said that we will say that that drug in particular is something that we must criminalise in all its forms. Personally, sir, and this is not the manifesto I stood on was to decriminalise cannabis, but I would suggest, sir, that we need to legalise, and we need to legalise all drugs because that is the only way to control them. The only way to control, to sort out what people are using in their bodies, what the proportion of them is, what the concentrations are, where they come from, the market. So that's never going to happen in our society, I don't think. But that is the way to control. You control by knowing what is there. And we are not doing that, and we're not doing that because there's a fear. There's a fear that goes with those issues, and that fear is about an influx of everybody wanting to try all of these drugs. So I'm getting on a bit now. I have no wish really to try different drugs at my age because simply because they're there. So I'm at an age where A nice comfy insole in my shoe gives me a huge amount of pleasure in the morning, sir. Simple life that I lead. And I think we have to be careful, and it's a trite comment really, but we have to be careful that we get this notion that we open a floodgate in some way. So we won't. What we will do is we will stop people being criminalised and start that process of control, of refining what is being used and actually understanding the real effects. So with proper research and proper understanding, if cannabis can be shown to be linked to psychosis in particular individuals, then we will know to be able to say to those particular individuals, using cannabis for you is a very dangerous thing. Do not do it because this is what's going to happen. And if you want to ban anyone from using it, it'll be those individuals. But we're not going down that line at the moment because of the criminalisation. We seem to have said, it's okay, we've sorted that problem because it's illegal. If it's illegal, it can't be happening and it won't happen. It is. And there are some times in this assembly we have to have a realisation that what we're doing needs to change. And on this occasion, sir, I would suggest that this proposition, and so I just get my screen up, I'm paperless at the moment because I'm trying to be, and I looked at the actual proposition itself, and one of the things about the actual proposition is I understand people talking about may have some issue with that, but that's, I think, the crux of the issue about the decriminalisation for personal possession, personal cultivation, as is now brought by Deputy Alex Curtis, and for the recreational use of cannabis. But Part B, sir, is an incredibly extensive list of the type of things that we need to do. Potential approaches to the decriminalisation, legalisation and regulation of cannabis, the regulation of it. Use in the presence of minors, I quite agree. That we should have no advertising for any sort of sugary food, fatty food, cigarettes, alcohol, anywhere near our school buildings. We should have a radius around them where nothing like that is advertised. They do that in many jurisdictions. This is the opportunity to create free zones around the places where our children are influenced most during the day. Social supply restriction of the sale to minors. And so I'm going through this on purpose because I think we need to look really carefully at the proposition that we're debating. The gram allowance, that's a difficult one because you have to look at the actual concentration of the chemicals that are involved in it. So you could have 10 grams with a lot of chemical in, or 5 grams with an awful lot of chemical in. There are also genetically engineered strains, which is one worry I have with cultivation of one might refer to as weapons-grade cannabis, which is really not good. Restrictions in the areas of consumption. That is a very important idea. By restricting areas of consumption, you control areas where consumption happens. That's where you can direct advice, you can direct support, you can direct help, and you can start to actually collect data, as somebody said. That's a strange word to have around this. I wonder how many people who want to talk about the use of cannabis sit around and say, yes, we need to have more data on this, but there you go. Roadside capacity tests and total allowance of cultivation. So alcohol and driving is illegal. People still do it. Alcohol is legal and an absolutely lethal drug. But most of us will go and have a glass of wine or beer or something. England are playing tonight, sir. They're going to win handsomely tonight, so I'm absolutely certain of that. And many, many people, it's associated with alcohol. But we accept that. So this is a difficult step forward to an assembly for this assembly. I recognise that because it's taken a leap into somewhat the unknown, and I understand the fears that people have. But I do not believe, sir, that decriminalisation will open floodgates in the way that people are saying. And I think in order to start that way along the pathway, we need to do something and not just leave it the way we are at the moment, because it's becoming, if anything, sir, more uncontrolled than ever. And taking back that hold of the reins of what's going on in terms of the use of drugs on our island, I think it's a very important thing to do. And the first step of that is decriminalisation. So I hope people can read the proposition very carefully and really consider supporting all parts of that, because I believe, sir, it would be a brave and sensible decision for us to make today. Thank you.
Deputy Vinay.
I think the debate is almost exhausted. Anyway, I'd like to start by thanking Deputy Coles for raising this issue, and it's been lurking around in the background for quite some time. It's certainly given us the opportunity to have a decent debate on the subject. So with regard to the current situation, I think a lot of us would agree two things relating to criminalisation. Firstly, it's failed rather miserably to achieve the objective of preventing the availability of cannabis. And secondly, it serves as a direct barrier to providing or assessing support or treatment for problematic drug use. Criminalisation also results in a complete lack of quality control or information about potency, strength, or any additional substances contained within the cannabis on the illicit market. Users can't guarantee what they're buying or using unless they cultivate it themselves, and of course that in itself is illegal. So, in the wider context, a 2016 United Nations General Assembly stressed the need for member states to adopt public health, human rights and other more constructive approaches to drug policy instead of continuing to promote the traditional avenues of criminalisation. And the UN General Assembly has urged member states to think about alternatives to criminal punishment for drug offences. Over 60 jurisdictions in 30 countries around the world have already adopted legal reforms to remove the criminalisation of certain aspects of drug use. However, it's worth noting that no two countries' approaches are exactly the same, so there certainly doesn't appear to be a blueprint for removing the criminalisation of cannabis. Interestingly, Jersey's own substance use strategy sets out, as part of Aim 5, to continue progression away from criminalisation by reviewing and adopting specific policy options that fall under decriminalisation and legalisation aims. But the hard truth is that we need to assess what the underlying priorities are in any approach to the removal of the criminalisation of cannabis before going any further. And we need to do this properly, sir. In 2018, the Assembly voted to enable the prescribing of medical cannabis. And for want of a better expression, that can best be described as a genie that's well and truly out of the bottle. We know from a dispensing of medical cannabis audit published earlier this year that Jersey has dispensing numbers of just over 4% of our adult population, compared to 0.04% of the UK population. And if my sums are correct, that's 100 users in Jersey for every single user in the UK, and so that's quite an extraordinary figure. Deputy Cole stated in his report that as a result of medical cannabis, we now have a two-tiered system. And for me, sir, that's something of an understatement. What we actually have is a multi-layered market, which is driven by high levels of prescribing and dispensing, and it takes the following form. We've got medical cannabis, which is prescribed and used for medical purposes. We've got medical cannabis prescribed and used for recreational use by the person it was prescribed to. And we have medical cannabis which is prescribed but ends up on the illicit market supplying other people. And this is the result of a decision being taken by the Assembly without firm proposals to manage the impact of that decision or any agreed approach as to how the future should look. And on a personal level, sir, I want to avoid a repeat of that situation. And if we're serious about all this, that's exactly what the Assembly should want too. To adopt a decriminalisation approach as set out in paragraph A of the proposition without first considering fully all of the repercussions of that decision is quite dangerous. Last week, completely unsolicited, the chair of the Misuse of Drugs Advisory Council wrote to me to express the Advisory Council's concerns after discussing the decriminalisation of cannabis at their most recent council meeting. I shared that letter with members by email, and I hope that they've had the time to read it, sir. But for those who haven't, this is their advice regarding decriminalisation. It would be making a significant change to our criminal law without properly considering both the legal and constitutional consequences. And they don't feel that that should be done without prior consideration. That we may create domestic and near-neighbour criminal law issues, such as potentially increased trafficking caused by increased demands for illicit supply. And we may inadvertently encourage importation, as some may regard decriminalisation as the additional decriminalisation of importation. There are a couple of constitutional risks as well, sir, like breaching the UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs and potential risk to our customs and trade arrangements with the UK. So I think we need to consider which consequential legislative changes would be appropriate, which amendments to other legislation would be required, such as the misuse of drugs law, the restrictions on smoking law, and how the prohibition on smoking medical cannabis should be amended to align with any decriminalisation of cannabis. The Advisory Council's letter also touches on the language of the proposition and the uncertainty it brings, as decriminalisation can mean a range of things in a range of settings. If you stack the various uncertainties of paragraph A on top of one another, you end up with a proposition that can allow for a wide range of possible outcomes. Given all the possible outcomes within the wording of paragraph A, the potential unknowns of making a decision without much more thought and information, and the highlighted risks I've already touched upon, I'm afraid I find myself unable to vote for paragraph A, but certainly not at this time. Paragraph B of the proposition can still stand, regardless of the adoption or rejection of paragraph A, and therefore I intend to vote against paragraph A, but vote for paragraphs B and C. And having any debate on the different approach to cannabis in Jersey, there are a huge number of both foreseeable and unforeseeable factors that we simply must consider. I do honestly recognise the need for, and I definitely welcome, a full and informed debate on the matter, and the adoption of paragraph B would provide a clear mandate for further work to be done, and at the core of any future debate, there'll be a set of clear evidence-based proposals. We must not choose an approach without careful prior consideration of all the factors and without having an understanding of how they might best be managed. These factors include, but are not limited to, what are the potential physical and mental health implications of any approach? What is the desired impact on the illicit market for drugs and the wider supply chains? How to evidence harm reduction, how to design and deliver prevention and education initiatives, how to provide improved access and support, and how best to continue to protect children and the wider community. There are a range of others, people are probably tired. With proposals that provide further information on all of the things I've just mentioned, we, the Assembly, would be able to make an informed decision with a clear view of the wide-ranging repercussions that would ensue. So I've spoken to Deputy Coles, and whilst the proposition sets out a deadline for November 2025, if paragraph B is supported by the Assembly, we will aim to bring forward those proposals by July 2025. However, it's important to mention that paragraph B, irrespective of delivery date, still results in additional and as yet unresourced work. As mentioned in the financial and staffing statement in the Council of Ministers amendment, there will need to be conversations regarding prioritisation of existing work. In closing, and for the avoidance of doubt, sir, I believe that, as a general rule, prohibition doesn't work and the island will be better served by a properly regulated market where problem drug users are treated and assisted rather than criminalised. Part B allows for such options to be properly formulated and presented to the State Assembly for them to decide upon in an open and democratic manner. Therefore, I urge members to reject Part A at this stage, but accept paragraphs B and C as amended. Thank you, sir.
Very much, Deputy Lehegerer.
Thank you, sir. Firstly, I would like to thank Deputy Coles for clarifying the myth that there are persons detained in Lamoy Prison for possession of personal amounts of cannabis. There is not. And I would suggest, sir, that it's probably unlikely that there ever was. People who receive prison sentences will be importation, supply or intent to supply, having been arrested for public order offences, driving whilst impaired or involved in road traffic collisions or assaults. I would just like to highlight a couple of the factors which I think may cause us some difficulties. There is a concern about how a decriminalisation system could be policed. If we allow personal possession but not dealing, then as the proposition suggests, we have set a maximum limit for how much cannabis a person can possess. Whatever limit is set, the burden will fall on police officers to try and work out exactly how much cannabis a person is carrying. It is going to be nearly impossible to try and establish the exact weight of a sample of cannabis in the street in order to determine if the person should be arrested for potential drug dealing or allowed to go on their way. In relation to the point of the cultivation, on Ireland, personal cultivation could create further difficulties. Unless it is spelled out in exactly simple terms as to exactly what type of species of plant is allowed, what weight is being grown, even how many plants exactly are growing in a particular place, will all be challenging, and the proposal as drafted allows no rights for the police officer to enter the property to try and establish that fact. How will we decide whether or not the person is allowed to actually grow their own or not? Somebody suggested that we may be able to make rules about that. Well, if we're going to allow one person to be able to grow cannabis, I would suggest that we should have to allow everybody. We can't discriminate against from one person to where you may or may not live. There is also, as we all know, a smell to cannabis. As you drive past places where it grows, and I'm not talking about people smoking it, you can smell it. How will your neighbours feel when you're growing cannabis? And where are you going to grow it? You're going to grow it in the garden. But my biggest concern about all of this is how are we going to manage in a family home that people are growing cannabis? How are we going to manage the welfare of the young people within that environment? How are we going to decide whether young children are going to be involved? How are we going to know whether the smoking of cannabis is ongoing? And we're actually going to be contributing to that. It is very different when you talk about something which is legal or not legal. So if we're actually going to allow people to grow cannabis, we're accepting the fact that they may very well be growing it within their home where they have young children. And how are we going to manage and police that? The other thing I would like to point out is that Deputy Morrell talked about, and just bear with me for a minute, Ma'am, talked about all of these different studies. And different studies say different things. And I'll give you an example here. For instance, a study by Shorey in 2018 found the marijuana use was significantly associated with various forms of inter-partner violence, including physical, psychological and sexual violence. This association persisted even after accounting for other risk factors like alcohol use, antisocial personal traits and relationship dissatisfaction. Another one says that Flanagan also observes that cannabis use can have an impact on inter-partner violence, and there are others that say the opposite. So let's not be unclear here that one piece of information will say one thing and another may say something else. So, Ma'am, sorry I called you sir then. So therefore, I have one other thing to say. A lot of areas already been covered. With half my working life being involved in policing in the island, I've had significant experience with all our community. I've seen the impact of drug use, both from the users themselves, the family, children and young people who share that home. So let's not be under any illusion here. This will have an impact. We're all fully aware that alcohol has an impact as well. So I'm not taking that aside from that. Having discussed the matter with people who deal with domestic violence and the impact that cannabis has, and it is in their mind, and no doubt in mine, that this can have an impact on family life and children within those families. And from the point of view that, as someone highlighted earlier, I decided not to do an in-committee debate. That decision was made first and foremost because this area, it does not fall under myself, it falls under the Health Minister. My priorities have been with violence against women and girls, amongst others, and also the law in relation to modern-day slavery. But if I'm actually going to stand here and say that I'm going to try and eradicate and work hard to deal with violence against women and girls, I cannot support this and I won't.
Deputy Renouf.
Thank you, Ma'am. So, in my mind, did I say sir straight away? Ma'am, in my mind, this is about how we confront reality, and in particular the reality that cannabis is used in this island. So it's about the collision between reality and morality, and even between reality and science. And these are uncomfortable places to be. But we do have a responsibility to face up to them. The second point I would make is that we are, as a society, on a journey with regard to cannabis. It is a journey away from criminalisation and towards liberalisation, and probably eventually legalisation. We're being asked in this proposition to take a step, and it feels to me like a measured one. 60 years of legislation to criminalise has failed. Criminalisation has failed. We must have in our minds that cannabis exists and will be used. So our question has to be, how do we deal with that situation? I thought Deputy Miles' speech caught the moment we find ourselves in brilliantly. This proposition is a step. Yes, we need to be careful. But let us take the cautious step that this amended proposition represents. I did think there was an alarmism in some of the speeches. Cannabis does, of course, have an effect. It's a drug. That's the whole point. Some will have positive experiences, some will have negative experiences. But I repeat, it is going to be used. It is used at the moment. We permit all kinds of substances that have negative effects. So does decriminalising cannabis encourage use? Does it do that through lowering social barriers, perhaps? I would argue that bird has flown. In fact, you could just as well argue that the cachet of an illegal activity is attractive certainly to young people, and maybe fueling the attractiveness of experimenting with the drug. Deputy Wilson's speech, I thought, was a powerful one, but it was a powerful argument to me against the lax regulation of medicinal cannabis. It was not persuasive to me regarding decriminalisation. I would reiterate the points made by Deputy Mezek and Deputy Morell, amongst others, that there's a double standard with relating to alcohol. But there's also another double standard, which we haven't referenced, which is to do with encouraging medicinal cannabis, and in particular the production of medicinal cannabis. We believe as a society that cannabis can have medicinal properties, otherwise we surely would not have licensed companies to produce it and sell it. This is why I say that we are on a journey. We have moved away from pure outright opposition. So I think, in common with many other substances, we can decriminalise and still advise against its use or advise caution around its use. We have plenty of those substances in society. The bottom line is we're not going to stop people using it. We're not going to stop people trying it. We're not going to make it less attractive. Deputy Lahegara said police officers will struggle with measuring the amounts. Well, that's the case now with the AG's advice, I would have thought. And similarly with plants. We allow commercial planting. Why would we not allow people, if we allow it on a commercial large scale, to grow a small specified number of plants within the home? The risk, of course, is that kids may be exposed to that. Well, possibly. I don't think my kids have any idea what I'm growing in the house. But for the avoidance of doubt, it is not weed. So I would say the proposition allows us to move forward with detailed proposals properly considered. The Drugs Advisory Council advice, I'm afraid I read it as a wall of opposition which, if followed, would never allow any jurisdiction to decriminalise, and yet countries have decriminalised. And I think we can take that measured step. So looking at the proposition as amended, Part A is the point that moves us on. It moves the debate on and moves the position on and says we want to decriminalise. Part B gets into the detail and gives responsibility to the government to bring forward the good legislation that will enable that to happen. And we will get to decide whether that job has been done well, because that will have to come back to the Assembly to be voted on. And Part C extends those same 2 points to about legal decriminalisation and further legislation to cannabinol. So we're asked, one speaker said, to make a responsible decision. I think it is responsible to modernise the law. It is responsible to open our eyes and ask that the government go away and bring back legislation in a considered way. And it is responsible to make the law face up to reality that cannabis exists and will be used. And we will have another chance to decide in the future if the proposals being brought forward in legal terms are proportionate and right. So I will be voting for all three elements.
Thank you, Deputy. Next on the list, just so members are aware, I've got Deputy Taddier, then Deputy Doublé, then the Constable of Grouville. Deputy Taddier.
Ma'am, there is a particular high at the moment that is perfectly legal that young people are turning to in droves. It's not just young people, but they're particularly susceptible to it. They start off with a long walk. They then move on to jogging. Then before you know it, they're doing park runs. You've got pushers of exercise deliberately targeting vulnerable people by peddling harmless-sounding initiatives like Couch to 5K, sometimes disguising the efforts with innocuous-sounding terms like fun runs, and encouraging people to get out there to achieve this buzz that they get, this so-called sounding harmless buzz that they get once they've completed their runs. And before you know it, they're doing things like half marathons, and I even heard of somebody recently signing up to do a marathon. Complete madness, because it sounds like it's great, doesn't it? Until I know a guy who did one of these runs. He ended up getting a stroke. I know another one who, years on after they've given up, they end up with loads of problems to their knees. It's particularly problematic if people have underlying problems relating to arthritis. Of course, they don't tell them this when they're pushing those kind of runs. Initially, it's a slippery slope. And I even heard of one guy who twisted his ankle whilst playing tennis. So there are risks in that. And I think we have to be careful about actually encouraging this kind of activity in our community. And some of the speeches I heard earlier when it's talking about the risks associated with cannabis, I thought was out of the 1936 film Reefer Madness. I didn't think they could possibly be serious when we're hearing some of those comments. I haven't seen the film, but I'm told that it was had a particular cult following in the 80s and 90s. I particularly like a quote from the film, though. It says, "Marijuana is taken by musicians," and I'm not speaking about good musicians, but the jazz type. So I hope we've come on a little bit since the 1930s, but a lot of that same propaganda that we would have heard in that film, and I think we are still dealing with today, and we've got to try and unpack that. What I'm slightly concerned about with this proposition in terms of the Minister's comments is that he seems to be sending out quite a mixed message, which is essentially, as I see it, there are two parts. We've already seemed to have made some progress in the amendments in this debate already, saying that, okay, look, on balance, we did vote for an amendment so that people could grow their own and cultivate their own at home if they're going to be users of this product, which we're hoping to decriminalise. The Minister told us himself that he wants full legalisation, and we've heard some very capable arguments, I think, some eloquent arguments put forward from the proponents of those who want full legalisation, so I don't need to reiterate those. And it seems strange that we would therefore stop short of it by a much more moderate proposal that we have. Is the first step towards that is surely to say that if people are currently using, for whatever reason, the first step is surely to decriminalise them, to make sure that also that they can access homegrown a variety themselves, so that they don't have to turn to criminality if they want to. And then, of course, we let the Minister get on with it and do his piece of work about how all the rest of it ties in, and we might get to legalisation if it's the desired will of the future Assembly once he's come back with that piece of work. I also don't really see how it ties in with the other work streams that are going on around violence against girls and women. I think that's an important piece of work which I think we all support in this Assembly, and I think which needs to continue, and I think we can now give, we will give a renewed mandate to the Home Affairs Minister to do that. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, so I would like to think we can discount that argument of it being an either-or. I don't think I've got a lot else to say on this particular debate. I think what I would encourage the mover of this proposition to consider is taking it en bloc. We can have that discussion, I'm sure. I think it would be strange if we were to say that we wouldn't accept Part A, but we want the Minister to go away and legalise something that we're not even comfortable about decriminalising. Does that seem to make sense to people, to members? So if we don't want to decriminalise cannabis, then certainly let's not think about asking the Minister to go away and do a piece of work about decriminalising it and about legalising it completely. But if we are comfortable asking him to go away and effectively start legislating and working out the legislation for legalising, then at least let's decriminalise it in the meantime. I hope that's not an overly simplistic argument, Mum, but that's how it works in my simple little brain.
Deputy Doublé.
Thank you, Mum. Could I ask the SG a brief question before I make my speech, related to the question that Deputy Jearn asked about valid prescriptions, and that the Solicitor General mentioned that it had to be a valid prescription. Could he just define what a valid prescription is? Is there a time limit? How is it determined whether a prescription is current or valid?
I should finesse the advice I gave earlier. I'm looking at paragraph 7 of the general provisions order made under the Misuse of Drugs Law. That provides an exemption from liability for an offence of possession, where a person, forgive me, I'll find it in a moment.
I'm happy to wait until the end of my speech, Mum, if the Solicitor General needs more time.
No, I'm there, sorry, forgive me. It doesn't have it's not an offence where the drug was supplied by or on the prescription of a doctor or registered independent prescriber. If at the time of the supply of the drug or prescription, the person was being supplied with any controlled drug by or on the prescription of another doctor. So I should have read, it doesn't apply where someone has it for the administration for medical, dental or veterinary purposes in accordance with the directions of a practitioner or a registered independent prescriber. Now, the absence of a valid prescription or the absence of any prescription at all would not necessarily be conclusive that the offence of simple possession had been committed, but it would be very good evidence that it had been committed. It might lead to further inquiries of the GP. He might say, or she might say, for example, it's in fact my fault. This person is taking this cannabis under my direction, but I just omitted to renew the prescription. And that would be something to be put in the scales by a prosecutor in deciding whether the offence had been committed, and if so, whether it was in the public interest to prosecute it. So I hope that helps clarify the advice I gave earlier.
Thank you. I do remain unclear over what the actual definition of a valid prescription is, and I wonder if actually that's something in the law that needs to be looked at, because I think those who do hold those prescriptions need that clarity that around that question that Deputy Jearn raised. I really enjoyed Deputy Tadier's speech, and I think a lot of the reflections that many of us have had on the problems that could be caused potentially by cannabis use that are most certainly also caused by alcohol use, which is a legal substance. I thought Deputy Tadier made that point very, very cleverly there. I wanted to touch on Deputy Lehegrat's speech, and she mentioned a study, ma'am, on inter-partner violence, which of course is something that we all want to eradicate in our society, and that there was some correlation between cannabis use. But I would argue that is a correlation between cannabis use in a society that criminalises cannabis use, and that the correlation there actually is between violence and those who are having the confidence or the knowledge to actually access drugs illegally, and the profile of the type of person that might be minded to do that. Another concern that has been raised by previous speakers was that young people will take up cannabis use as a result of decriminalisation. And, ma'am, I wanted to refer members to the substance use strategy, which was adopted by the previous government and I believe is still in place with the current government, and indeed covers a 10-year period of time to 2033. And I'll quote from that strategy that cannabis is the most common illicit drug taken by young people. In 2021, 11% of 14 to 15-year-olds and 23% of 16 to 17-year-olds reported ever using cannabis. Those rates were similar at 13% and 28% respectively in 2018. So, ma'am, islanders, including young people, are already using this drug, and as other members have covered, they're having to obtain it illegally, and this is making them criminals. And I really want to reinforce the point that criminalising substance use does not stop people using it. It is already happening. And it will continue to happen, and we will continue to make young people and islanders criminals if we do not decriminalise cannabis use. There is consensus amongst experts that criminalisation is not the best way to reduce harm, and the Deputy in his opening speech touched on a harm reduction approach, and that is the gold standard in terms of drugs policy. And I think, again, Deputy Tadier touched on this as well, there is a large amount of unlearning that we need to do, because those of us who had it drilled into us at school that drugs are bad, it's difficult to move away from that messaging, and we must stop. We must pause and challenge our thinking and stop just blindly repeating that aged phrase and look at the scientific evidence about what is right for our population. So, Mum, rather than repeating drugs are bad, we must understand that drugs are inevitable. Imbibing consciousness-altering substances is, in fact, a universal human trait found in cultures across our planet and across time. Humans for centuries have gathered around communal fires. Communities have come together to relax and celebrate, to enjoy being together and to enjoy just being alive. And again, there are universal things that go with this: storytelling, music, perhaps some dancing. And something else that is pretty much universal is substances, Mum. Drinking squashed fermented fruit juice and smoking dried leaves, and there's probably a lot more dancing when the substances are involved. Those things, those activities, when done as part of a community, they feel good, and it's part of being human. Those substances and the use of those substances only become problematic when the societal context changes, and I will speak more about this at the end of my speech. I want to return to young people, ma'am. As the cost of obtaining cannabis illegally is increasing exponentially, young people are turning to other more harmful substances. And again, to quote the substance use strategy, there is evidence of displacement of cannabis by synthetic cannabinoids. And the strategy goes on to say, during the 2018 to 2021 period, self-reported synthetic cannabinoid use increased. In 2018, 2% of 14 to 15-year-olds and 4% of 16 to 17-year-olds reported ever using synthetic cannabinoids. By 2021, this had risen to 13 and 25%, respectively. Synthetic cannabinoids are generally stronger than natural cannabis and are linked to higher rates of addiction and psychosis. So, ma'am, our current policies and our current legislation are resulting in an increase in harm right now to our young people. The evidence shows that when decriminalisation is done properly, it does not increase use. So, and to go back to the scene that I painted of a community coming together and substances being a part of that when used responsibly, when we do not have that community and we do not have care for one another socially and good quality health care, that's when the substances can become a problem. If they're used in isolation, that's a problem. Ma'am, when I say decriminalisation must be done properly, I mean that our health and social policies must be robust, our services must be of an excellent standard, and our community must provide play and leisure opportunities and be a supportive community. So, ma'am, the substance use strategy outlines a pathway for us to move towards decriminalisation in a healthy way that minimises harm. And I noted that it has many, many action points that refer to alcohol use. And I hope that all members who have concerns about harms caused by substances will realise that that is where we should be focusing our efforts, not on cannabis. Deputy Gardner found an event, actually, which is, I think, tomorrow, by Amnesty International, which is an organisation that I greatly respect. And they have launched a new policy paper to contribute to the advancement of drug policies that better uphold human rights. And of course, across the Assembly, I know we are all in favour of human rights. And Amnesty International is calling on legislatures to adopt new models of drug control that put the protection of people's health and other human rights at the centre, including the decriminalisation of use, possession, cultivation and acquisition of drugs for personal use. It does go on, ma'am. I trust organisations like Amnesty International. I trust scientists. I trust the policy experts. All of those experts and organisations are recommending decriminalisation. We would be foolish, sir, ma'am, to not approve this proposition today, and I will be supporting it.
Constable of Grouville.
Thank you, ma'am. I do believe that I agree with many of the previous speakers, especially when they relate to the topic of alcohol, which has been around for thousands of years. I believe some water was changed into wine a couple of thousand years ago, so I'm sure we'll assume that that is true. Unfortunately, it has affected my close circle. I've lost a cousin to its addiction. I lost a very good friend, in fact, the godfather of one of my children to its addiction not long ago. But this assembly in 2012 introduced the Lion SL 500, which is a breathalyzer, and many years prior to that, the SL 400, which was a much larger and more cumbersome item to use in a police car. However, what I'm trying to emphasise here is the fact that the police have in their armoury something to test for alcohol consumption. At a scrutiny panel the other day, I asked two senior officers, have you got anything currently in your armoury to test, roadside test, for any other substances? And I referred immediately to cannabis at that point. And the answer, sadly, was no. The technology is not yet available that makes a reliable and reasonably priced testing device that they can use on the roadside. So how can we possibly be even thinking of decriminalising any substance right now until that technology is caught up and we can test at the roadside for those sorts of substances? My dear friend that passed away would never have taken his problem out into the public arena. He would never have got behind the wheel of a car and taken that on the road and endangered other road users, cyclists, walkers, with his problem. So why are we even talking about this, I would say? We have just had some damning road safety statistics recently published where it quite clearly states that we're the worst jurisdiction in the British Isles for road safety. Surely we must take a lesson from that and say that why are we even discussing this when technology has not yet caught up with roadside testing? That's all I have to say, ma'am. Thank you.
Deputy Miller.
Thank you, ma'am. I hadn't been intending to speak in this debate, and I have some considerable reservations about this proposition. But one of the things that has in fact shocked me to a degree about this debate is the argument that we should be decriminalising and possibly legalising cannabis because that will be good for young people. And I simply cannot get my head around that argument. Deputy Wilson spoke very effectively about the impact of cannabis on young people, I think up to the age of 25. It's not just teenagers. Deputy Luce spoke very powerfully about his experiences on the youth panel. We know that cannabis, I cannot accept, I have read nothing that tells me that cannabis is not harmful to adults or to children and young people. We know the fact that we know that alcohol and tobacco are harmful doesn't make that an argument to make cannabis more easily available to young people. We know that alcohol is damaging to our health, and the research has developed on that over years. I don't remember being told as a child never ever to drink alcohol, but over the years the advice on alcohol has changed dramatically to you can drink as much as you want, to don't drink while you're pregnant, to don't drink more than 21 units, to don't drink more than 14 units, to there is no safe limit for alcohol. And yes, we do, those of us who enjoy a glass of wine, make that risk assessment every Friday night or Saturday night. And we may or may not regret it the following morning. But we know The risks are very clear about alcohol. Similarly, the risks are even more clear about tobacco. I've spoken to doctors who have said, if I can stop one person smoking, I've had a good day at work. That is the most effective thing I can do for anybody's health. And we know the harms that tobacco cause and have caused for a very long time. I was involved as a relatively newly qualified lawyer in the first ever tobacco legislation in Scotland, and we did a massive piece of research trying to work out just how long it had been since people understood that smoking tobacco was bad for them. I think fundamentally I can't accept that our bodies are designed to inhale smoke of any nature, or steam or whatever that we are currently inhaling, and do that safely, because we are not designed to do that. Parents give advice to the children day in, day out. As I've said, when I grew up, it was all about not smoking, and that was what we were told at school as well. What will parents be saying to the children now? Well, it's not good for you, but, well, it's not criminal or legal, so, You know, criminality or illegality seems to me to be an extra tool in any parent's toolkit to try to dissuade an activity for children. And I know a number of people here who have spoken today do have children, and I just wonder what you will be saying to your children in future years about cannabis. Will you be saying, yes, it's fine, or will you be saying, don't do it, but it's not criminal, therefore, it doesn't really matter? And the fact that the physical harm is overwhelmed by not having a criminal record. I just find this whole aspect of the impact on children as being a key driver in this debate very difficult. As for whether decriminalising it will make it more acceptable to young people, I think we just have to look at what's happening on our streets right now. We have people packaging up vapes, usable and disposable vapes, which are clearly aimed at children and are quite clearly being used by children. Are we going to have people standing at school gates with pink and rainbow-coloured wrappers of cannabis to give to young children because it's now okay for them to do that? We have got to think about what the response will be of people once this becomes decriminalised. If you can sell it to a child and it's not criminal, then people will do that. And I've heard all the arguments. I'm a lawyer. I've heard all the arguments about prohibition and how those work and how they don't. But I do think preventing the prevention of smoking or inhalation of cannabis by children has to be the most important thing we should have at the forefront of our mind, and I would ask everybody to keep that at the forefront of their mind. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy War and then the Constable of St Mary.
Thank you, Mum. Like many people of my generation, cannabis will always be considered as being part of that illicit world of drugs. I'll never forget when a boy at my school got expelled for being caught smoking cannabis. It didn't matter that when you reached the age of 17, you were allowed to consume 2 pints of beer in the in-school bar. Back then, it all made sense in the same way that no one frowned upon my dad's 60-a-day smoking habit. In that sense, I get Deputy Mezek's commentary. As I've reflected on this subject, I keep coming back to something that's probably quite old-fashioned. What legacy do I want to leave? Did I vote for something that decriminalised a product that had a huge negative health impact on the next generation? Is this, as Deputy Luce puts it, the thin end of the wedge? I recognise that we as a society have a schizophrenic approach to cannabis. Sorry, just jumping around here. To cannabis. So as a result, I've tried to overcome my own personal biases by asking individuals with a lot of knowledge in this area where the issues lie. It's an example where an in-committee debate would have added huge value to this debate, and I find it quite extraordinary that we didn't continue down that route. It's clear from the number of amendments brought to this proposition that it is really a complex area, and I feel I have to defer to those who have expert knowledge. I found Deputy Miles and Deputy Wilson's speeches hugely informative. With the development of medicinal cannabis, I recognise that we have another drug in the arsenal to help with pain relief, inflammation, anxiety and sleep. But because it's an unlicensed prescription, it's not available through the hospital. Bizarrely, however, we have 20 licensed individuals who are able to prescribe the drug, and prescriptions, as Deputy Binet has said, are 100 times the rate of those in the UK. It does demonstrate what a strange relationship society has with this drug. For me, the most obvious would be around addiction. Over recent years, we've heard all of the terrible impact of inappropriate opioid uses. Opioids are also used extensively for pain relief. We're all familiar with morphine, codeine, fentanyl, and oxycodone. The difference with opioids is their highly addictive nature. Not only do you need a prescription to take them, you also need a plan to stop taking them. A staggering 81,800 deaths were recorded in the US as a result of opioid misuse in 2022. No wonder we are suspicious about legalizing something that throughout my lifetime has always been illicit. As already explained by Deputy Wilson, cannabis use can lead to episodes of psychosis and schizophrenia, and Deputy Coles recognises this in his opening speech. The association of cannabis with psychosis was first recognised as far back as 1896. A significant piece of research in 1987 carried out by the Swedish Army concluded that those who had used cannabis more than 50 times were 6 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. There will, of course, always be individuals who will not be affected, in the same way that some people drinking too much alcohol don't get cirrhosis of the liver, or with a relation to heavy smoking, those who don't get lung cancer. The question that I again ask myself, if I am prepared to vote for decriminalisation, what legacy am I leaving for generations to come? Did I really understand the consequences of what I was voting for? I've tried to reflect upon other day-to-day drugs we already consume. Back in the day, tobacco was sold as this sexy product. Deputy Reniff used a far more appropriate word, cachet. He seems to be using a lot of those today. Getting your hands on something perceived as dangerous has always been attractive to young people. But look where we are today. Hideous images, no overt advertising, and the latest laws intend to ban the next generation from ever smoking tobacco. That's before I include the huge cost to our health service, the price society pays for legalising tobacco. I think the Constable of St Saviour makes a valid point. What is the message we want to send out? What is the legacy we want to leave? I can't vote for something which could have a major detrimental health effect to our society. That's not a legacy I want to be remembered for.
Constable of St Mary.
Thank you, ma'am. I wonder if it's too early to ask you to give a ruling on the form the vote might take for clarification. The Health Minister, amongst others, has suggested that he would advocate we should vote against paragraph A, but 4B. But given that A is the one which decriminalises the use of cannabis, does not B automatically fall away if A falls away?
It's entirely a matter for Deputy Coles as the proposer as to how he wishes to take the vote on this matter. I think they could be taken separately, but it's a matter for the proposer of the proposition as to whether they voted for en bloc or individually.
I accept that, ma'am, but I just wondered if you could clarify whether B would stand alone if A was not there.
I think it could stand alone from my observations of it. I can't see a reason why it wouldn't allow the Minister to then go away or the Council Minister to go away and bring forward some more recommendations. So this debate could resume some way down the future for us to revisit this issue. But what it wouldn't be doing is, obviously, if you didn't accept Part A, is progressing the decriminalisation at this point?
Sorry to persist, ma'am, but it's simply that B refers to the necessary legislation without in B referring to cannabis at all. And I just concern that without that link, whether it would stand. Anyway, thank you for your ruling.
Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Andrews.
Thank you, ma'am. Initially, when this proposition was lodged, it came as a bit of a surprise because something like this is so systemic and it's a broad issue, and usually it would be proposed by the executive and it would be something that the minister would be bringing forward. So it was quite unusual to see a backbencher bring forward this kind of proposition. And I have to say I don't really know too much about this topic whatsoever. And a bit like other politicians who've already spoken before, they were very much reliant upon the experts. And again, access to experts in Jersey on this particular subject is very difficult to have access to. But I did happen to be approached by an individual who is very much pro-cannabis, and I took up their offer to discuss this proposition with them. Now, there is an element of our constitutional relationship with the UK, and of course that is very important. And what we cannot be affording to see is Jersey compromise its relationship with the UK from a constitutional perspective, i.e. if this is, for instance, to be a proposition that is approved, what then happens with the Privy Council due to the UK differing on their stance with cannabis to the States Assembly. Now, looking at the proposition itself, initially I was a bit concerned about Part A, I have to say, and I even voiced my concerns to other members, but I was quite pleased to see that the Deputy did bring forward an amendment, having consulted with the Attorney General and the Children's Commissioner, so I think that part is rectified. Now, looking at Part B of the proposition, and I think the Council of Ministers have been quite prudent because it's more open to interpretation as to what can happen next. We're not too fixed in terms of what the decision we take today. And again, what you don't want to be doing is, for instance, approving the proposition and then legislation has to be brought forward before back before the Assembly when, of course, the Privy Council has to be involved. And again, they might repudiate what we have essentially approved as a legislature. So there is a difficulty with the mention of legislation and cannabis, I think, in any proposition that was to be brought forward before the Assembly. And having looked at Deputy Alex Curtis's amendment, and the reason why I voted against it is because I was quite concerned about the enforcement side of things. It's all very well having individuals cultivate cannabis for their own use, but it's difficult for police officers to enforce the prescribed amounts that are within law, because again you could quite easily see somebody who's cultivating cannabis exceeding the amounts of gram usage, and how a police officer is supposed to then, regulate that and enforce it. It's very difficult to do, and I can see why certain politicians have raised concerns about that particular issue as well. Now, from my own personal perspective, I have to say I have seen two friends, unfortunately, consume cannabis, and, well, it's been life-changing, unfortunately, for them. For one of them, they were in their late teens, and they tried cannabis for the first time, and it had life-altering changes, unfortunately, and they've not been able to be independent like most of their friends who've been able to, grow up, leave home, live independently, earn their own income. And I also saw the extent of the issues it caused for them psychologically as well. And it was only down to the health service intervening, and it took so much time to really get a diagnosis and the person's medication correct for the person to finally be stable. However, they were never the same person again. And for me, I have to take on board my experience being very close to that individual and supporting them, and being at the time very frustrated that I was unable to do anything to support them and to improve their situation. And I think we have to really recognise that. If we are speaking about decriminalising cannabis, demand for use will automatically increase. If we are looking at disincentives, for instance, if you're going to say, well, that's illegal, of course people are going to be apprehensive. Of course they're going to be cautious. Of course they're going to say, well, maybe I should not be taking cannabis or any illegal drugs, because, again, there is a consequence. If you are caught, we have a criminal justice system. And it could affect you as a young person. You might not have access to jobs like everybody else, despite the fact you might be a very talented individual. If you are found guilty of consuming cannabis, you just need to look at certain situations that I've certainly encountered, where, again, I've got a couple of talented friends who who could have done very well for themselves, but there are certain jobs that they can no longer apply for. Why? Because they have a criminal conviction. And so it is debilitating to a certain extent in terms of people are not maybe able to aspire high any longer, unless they maybe want to go self-employed, because, again, they can work for themselves. But if you're looking, for instance, to work as an employee, certain jobs, and certainly the higher paid jobs across the economy, employers are going to go, well, I'm sorry, but we have our criteria, and I'm sorry, you've got a record here, and we cannot accept you. And you have to respect that, Mum. You have to respect that, Mum. I had to think very carefully there. So, yeah, from my personal perspective, I do understand the for and the against arguments, I do. And I think there are valid arguments from both perspectives. But the one thing that I am a bit concerned with is, for instance, when Deputy Morell touched on the subject of it doesn't have any implications from a social perspective in terms of if somebody has consumed cannabis. Well, I would certainly disagree with that, because I've certainly seen what it can do to people once they have consumed cannabis. And certainly with one individual who I know, they became very paranoid. And again, they were in my social circle. And I remember in my early 20s, in fact, there was one thing that I said, and it was just something that I said ordinarily. It was nothing that was controversial. And they took it completely the wrong way. But had this happened 3 or 4 years previously, they'd have totally understood that nothing malicious was intended. And so there is an implication from a social perspective where people around those individuals will see a change. It might be more difficult for those individuals to integrate themselves into society. And also, as well, they could become more isolated, especially for new people who do encounter them. Because there may be changes to themselves from a psychological perspective, and that is something that is of a concern to me. As much as I do appreciate it's important to be liberal, socially liberal, and people should be given the opportunity to have their say, and people should also be able to articulate their views on the consumption of cannabis. But there is a hesitancy, especially with myself, about if we do approve Part A, is it maybe premature? And is it maybe better that we go with the Council of Ministers? Because I think they have the resource available to come back before the Assembly, and also there's an opportunity where research can be done, and states members, especially backbenchers, we probably need to be more informed, because at the moment I am not informed enough, and I have to say I'm not very educated on the consumption of drugs, nor am I cognizant of the details regarding cannabis, because again, I have no idea about drugs, because I've never smoked in my life, I've never taken drugs. So for somebody like me, I have to be informed, and I have to be informed with empirical evidence. And if empirical evidence isn't there, then it's a bit difficult for me to support something. And then, of course, in approving something, then, later down the line, if something bad does happen, then I have to be accountable to the electorate and my constituents. And I'd rather be safe and cautious and support Part B of a proposition. But I think in terms of looking at Part A for now, it's not something, unfortunately, for Deputy Coles that I can support him on. But as I said, earlier on, Ma'am, it's one of those topics that we'll probably look at, at the end of this term, 2026, and it'll probably be in the top 5 biggest debates that we've had, because it's such a big topic. It's a topic of significance. It's a bit like, let's say, the topic of termination of pregnancy. Again, if that was to be discussed on the floor of the Assembly, that's a systemic and island-wide issue that people do have a view on. And it's no different here speaking about cannabis. Of course, there is a pro-lobbying group behind the scenes, and some of those individuals, they do have a commercial interest. And I think that's also another area that I'd just like to touch on as well, because we've got 5 different cannabis farms. And from my perspective, in terms of regulation of those cannabis farms, we should really have regulation that is monitoring the input and output of those farms. So we need to know what exactly are they selling and to who as well. And that should all be reported, and that's in line with WHO, the World Health Organization, who've been quite prescriptive about the use of drugs. And I know that's maybe not been something that's being touched upon in this debate, but I do think it's quite important that it is mentioned, because of course we will have the firms in the cannabis industry very much wanting this to be approved today. But as politicians, we also have to counterbalance that with the mental health aspect as well, and the implications that will have for islanders, and especially young and vulnerable islanders as well. Because I go back to my friend who unfortunately took one puff and that was it. The next day they had alterations to the way how they're thinking, and it was their parent, in fact, who had no choice but to take them down to the hospital, and then they had to go to St Saviour's, and it just escalated and it got much worse. And that's something that we do have to bear in mind, because I don't think it's something that we really touched upon in terms of not individual cases, but those rare cases that have happened, and they still do happen, unfortunately, due to drugs and the availability of drugs. And again, despite the fact that it's illegal, it was disappointing to also see that some politicians had almost given up and said, well, you know what, we might as well just decriminalise all of those who consume drugs and allow drugs to be legal. And I think, well, it's all very well saying that, but what is the implication of a decision you take? How many people are going to be affected mentally because of it? We really don't know, and we've got to be very careful, I think, in the approach we take. Because I certainly don't want to be responsible for a young person who's potentially a talented young individual who has aspirations to do well in life, and because they consume drugs, they change just like that. And we're depriving a young person of the opportunity to fulfil their potential. So that's all I need to say. So thank you, Ma'am.
Ma'am, could I propose the adjournment?
The adjournment is proposed. Is that proposition seconded? Yes. Do members want to show if they are in favour of the adjournment? Those against? The Assembly stands adjourned until 9:30 tomorrow morning.